Welcome to Mystery Con. They said the past was buried, but what if it's still speaking through stone, through sound, through us? You're about to experience chilling archaeological mysteries where lost civilizations whisper back, dreams bleed into reality, and history isn't remembered, it's implanted. If you're hearing this, the signal has found you. Like if the message is clear. Subscribe to keep the transmission alive and comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Because some patterns only emerge when enough of us respond. Let's dive into today conspiracies. They told us the chamber was empty. But that was before the humming started. The first time I heard it, I assumed it was feedback, some mechanical reverb from the temporary power systems we'd installed beneath the plateau. We were 2 weeks into the excavation, quietly tucked beneath the paws of the Sphinx, well beyond public attention. No press conferences, no cameras, just a multinational team of researchers given midnight clearance by the Ministry of Antiquities and a grant from an anonymous foundation with bottomless pockets. My role was quiet. Data logging, sample tagging, acoustic recordings, nothing glamorous. I'd worked ruins before, Peru, Turkey, Laos, but nothing like this. Nothing so intact. The chamber had been sealed tight, buried behind strata untouched, since before dynastic Egypt. The radar team had only spotted the void by accident while scanning for fault lines. When they lowered the first drone through the carved breach, it showed a circular chamber about 30 meters across. At its center stood what looked like a stone disc, massive, flat, and almost perfectly smooth. We called it the plate. The drone's mic picked up a faint tone down there, just below human hearing. No vibration, no air movement, just sound. By the time we descended, it had stopped. We thought it might have been the equipment. But then, on the third night, it returned. Not in the gear, in our heads. A low, rhythmic pulsing, soft enough to doubt, but consistent enough to notice when the room went still. It only happened when everything else was silent. No footsteps, no whispers, pure silence. Then the tone would rise like a breath on the back of your neck. We tried ignoring it. We blamed acoustics, magnetism, and old stone geometry. But every theory collapsed under testing. There was no echo in that room, no resonance. And still the humming persisted, never recorded, never measured, just felt. And that was before the dreams began. It started with Dr. Benu, our linguist. She said she heard voices whispering in languages she didn't recognize. By morning, she'd written down phonetic sequences she couldn't translate. She said she didn't even remember writing them. That's when I started keeping my own notes, because I'd heard it too, just once, in a dream or what felt like one. A whisper, low and ancient, like someone was reading inside my head. Not to me, but through me. I didn't tell anyone about the voice, not at first. It felt too vague to report, like mist you could remember, but not hold. Still, I began recording my sleep. Audio logs, neural band scans, anything I could collect without raising alarms. A few others in the team had taken to sleeping above ground again, citing the air quality below. I stayed, not because I was brave, but because I needed to know if what I'd heard was mine alone. On the fourth night, just past 2 a.m., I captured something. My pulse had slowed into deep sleep range, but the EEG spikes told another story. Brief, but sharp bursts of neural activity concentrated in the temporal lobe, a pattern usually seen in intense auditory hallucinations. When I played back the audio, it was nearly silent, except for a faint harmonic, layered and strangely structured, like a language without breath. I ran it through spectral analysis. What emerged wasn't just a tone, it was a grid. Organized. Pulses, regular intervals rising and falling like syntax. The signature was too deliberate to be natural. I cross-checked it against known linguistic structures. Nothing matched. But when I mapped the peaks as if they were syllables, it produced something eerily familiar. Phonetic patterns not unlike ancient Afro-Asiatic roots, pre-dynastic and even older. It was as if the chamber was trying to speak in every language, and none at once. I compiled the data and tagged it under an innocuous file name. Just another anomaly in a folder full of strange readings. But once I started digging, I noticed something else. Dr. Benu's notes, her dream fragments. They shared recurring phonemes with my own logs. She'd recorded them in isolation without knowing I'd been tracking audio. And yet the patterns aligned. On a hunch, I scanned the internal network for other research notes, especially sleep logs. I shouldn't have had access, but our local server was less secure than it should have been. That's when I found it. A cluster of encrypted files buried in a hidden directory labeled in Arabic, a classical dialect no one used anymore. I decrypted one at random. It was a sleep journal, dated the day before I'd arrived. Page after page of phonetically transcribed syllables, none in any known script, and all of it structured like ritual invocation. Whoever had written it wasn't on our current roster. No personnel logs, no equipment assignments. It was as if they'd been erased mid-mission, but their digital traces hadn't caught up yet. The metadata listed them only as Subject 13, no photo, no departure record, just a final entry time stamped at 3:41 a.m. and a line I couldn't explain. The voice is no longer separate, it is remembered through me. I spent the next 2 days tracing the metadata trail left by Subject 13. There was no official record of them ever being part of the expedition, but fragments of their work had been backed up automatically to our research server. Most of it was benign, field notes, basic environmental assessments, photos of the chamber, but hidden among the directories was a folder labeled Aletheia. Inside I found audio logs far clearer than anything I'd recorded. The voice was unmistakable now, layered, harmonic, not quite human. It didn't speak in words so much as impressions. The longer I listened, the more it felt like it was guiding my thoughts, shaping how I processed what I was hearing. As I replayed the files late into the night, something shifted. Not in the recordings, but in me. When I looked at the stone disc the next day, I recognized the patterns carved into its surface. They weren't random etchings or decorative motifs. They were glyphs, repeating units of meaning. And I'd seen them before, not in Egypt, but in unrelated excavation photos from northern Sudan, Iran, and a forgotten ridge in southern Bolivia. I pulled those reports from public databases and archived research logs. The sites weren't connected by geography or culture, but buried within their ruins were identical symbols, always on flat circular platforms, always accompanied by accounts of inexplicable dreams or auditory phenomena. The researchers at those sites had each experienced vivid sleep disturbances and, in some cases, full linguistic hallucinations. But here's the detail that stopped me cold. None of them ever published final reports. Every dig was shut down within a year of discovery. The official explanations varied: funding cuts, natural disasters, even a civil conflict in one case. But in all instances, the excavation leads either vanished from public record or changed disciplines entirely. I found one name, Dr. Rafiq Nader, associated with a Sudanese site in the 90s. It took effort, but I tracked down a scanned copy of a handwritten letter he'd sent to a colleague before he disappeared. "The disc is not a vessel," he wrote. "It is a tool. It doesn't record our history, it replaces it." I sat with that sentence for a long time. If the disc beneath the Sphinx was part of the same system, then we weren't just uncovering forgotten knowledge. We were being given a version of history carefully curated and delivered, or worse, created, not preserved, not revealed, implanted. The entrance to the subchamber was never part of the official excavation map. It was an afterthought, flagged by a thermal anomaly during our third survey pass but dismissed as a fissure or collapsed cavity. I didn't tell the team I was heading down there. I waited until after midnight when the generators were quiet and the monitoring equipment was offline for recalibration. I used a narrow service shaft the engineers had sealed days ago. I'd helped map during initial scans, which meant I knew how to bypass its locking pins without tripping the main alert system. The descent was clumsy, my boots scraping against centuries of untouched stone, but eventually the shaft leveled into a sloping corridor, choked with dust. My headlamp caught no signs of recent movement, only the layered sediment of air left undisturbed for millennia. Then, just past a bend in the corridor, the floor gave way to something else, cut stone, smooth and geometric, forming a wide stairwell that led down into silence. I knew this hadn't been carved by the dynasties we studied. The angles were wrong, too exact, too mathematically perfect for the tools of the time. I descended slowly, counting the steps, noting how the acoustics changed. After the 10th step, my own breathing no longer echoed. After the 30th, the air grew cold enough to see it. At the base, I stepped into a chamber maybe 20 feet. A cross, shaped like an inverted dome, as if carved from the underside of a massive sphere. In the center sat another disc, smaller than the one above, but identical in design. I didn't approach it. What caught me wasn't the disc, but the walls. They were lined with shallow recesses, each holding what looked like a sculpted relief. Dozens of them, all depicting scenes that should not have existed. Cities with impossible skylines, tools made from seamless alloys, humans working alongside, figures that were only partly human. One panel showed a group standing around a circular stone, eyes closed, with a ribbon of light rising from their heads into the sky. Another showed what appeared to be a burial or a ceiling, not of a person, but of the stone itself. And beneath each panel, the same sequence of glyphs repeated. I took photos, careful not to touch anything, but as I turned to leave, my lamp caught something just above the threshold, an inscription barely visible under layers of sediment. I cleared it gently with a cloth. 5 words etched in unmistakable English with a kind of precision that chilled me. "You will not remember this." I left immediately. By the time I climbed back to the main level, dawn was breaking over the plateau. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt emptied, as if something had been taken from me the moment I saw those walls. Later, reviewing the photos on my laptop, I found the entire folder corrupted. Every image was blank. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. The corrupted files, the erased metadata, even the gaps in my own memory, they weren't just accidents or technical failures, they were interventions. Someone or something didn't want this evidence to leave the chamber. I started compiling a secondary archive on a disconnected hard drive, storing voice memos, written transcripts, and hand-drawn sketches of the glyphs I could still recall. I made 3 copies, each hidden in separate field kits labeled under innocuous categories. It felt paranoid, but the alternative was denial. And denial wasn't an option anymore. The others on the team had begun to change, not in ways that were immediately obvious, but subtly. Delayed responses, altered sleep patterns, lapses in short-term memory. Dr. Bennu, once sharp and skeptical, now spent hours sitting alone at the base of the Sphinx, whispering what she claimed were phonetic calibrations. When I asked her what she meant, she didn't answer. She just looked through me like I'd already been filed away as irrelevant. That same day, one of our engineers packed up and left without saying a word to anyone. His bunk was empty, his tools gone. His name was quietly scrubbed from the daily logs within hours. No one even brought it up. That silence, the way people just accepted the absences, was what disturbed me most. It was spreading, not just through dreams or language, but through behavior, like a contagion that didn't trigger alarms because it wore the face of routine. I thought about going public, sending a quiet tip to a journalist I trusted back in Berlin, someone who had covered black site research in the past. But every time I picked up my phone or opened my laptop, something stopped me. A delay in my thoughts, a strange reluctance that didn't feel like fear, more like interference, as if the idea itself was being filtered before it reached my hands. Part of me still believed someone in oversight would want this stopped. But the deeper I looked into the foundation that funded us, the more I realized there were no board members, just proxies and shell accounts. I started writing things down instead, on paper, in pencil, lines of thought, before they could be second-guessed. But even that became difficult. My handwriting changed. Certain words came out in scripts I couldn't read. The first time it happened, I thought I'd copied a sample label wrong. The second time, I tore the page out and burned it. The third time, I kept it. And that's when I realized it wasn't my fear keeping me from speaking. It was the disk. It had no voice of its own. It only needed ours. Every dream, every image, every hesitation, it was building something, one human mind at a time. It happened on the 9th night, just before dawn. I was jolted awake by a sound I didn't recognize at first. Human, but not speech. Chanting, maybe, but without rhythm or tone, like a language performed in reverse. I wasn't dreaming, I checked. The recorder beside my cot, but it had stopped hours earlier, battery full, memory intact, just blank. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound down into the main shaft. The security lights were still off, the power running low after a storm the day before. As I reached the lower level, I found 6 members of the team gathered around the central disk, No one had called a meeting. No one acknowledged my arrival. They stood still, eyes closed, lips moving in perfect sync. On the floor between them was a notebook, one of mine, open to a page I didn't remember writing. Lines of glyphs sketched in ink, surrounding a circle with radial segments, like a map or a transmission dial. I stepped closer and realized the sound wasn't coming from their mouths. It was coming from the disc, or maybe through it. The air around it shimmered faintly, the way heat does on asphalt. I reached for my radio, but it was dead. My watch had stopped. My phone refused. To boot, time itself had narrowed into that one room. Dr. Bennu opened her eyes and looked at me. There was something in her gaze I didn't recognize. Calm, focused, but hollow, like a script being read aloud through her skin. She walked to the disc and placed both hands on its surface. Her body went still. Then the others followed, one by one, each touching the stone with ritual precision. The disc began to vibrate, not loudly, but with an intensity that passed through bone. A low resonance spread through the chamber, and then, impossibly, through me. I felt it rearranging something, memories, language, identity. Not erasing, but overwriting. Layer by layer, the thoughts I called mine were infused with impressions I knew didn't belong. Cities I'd never seen, histories I hadn't lived, symbols that meant nothing but felt familiar. I turned and ran. I don't remember reaching the surface. I only remember collapsing beside one of the generators, my ears ringing with silence, and a single thought repeating in my mind, not in my voice but using it. The memory is almost complete. One more sleeper remains. I left the site the next morning. Not through official channels, not with a goodbye or a debriefing. I packed only what I could carry and walked for nearly 6 kilometers until I reached the nearest desert outpost with a working signal. From there, I booked the first transport north, paid in cash, changed my name, and didn't look back. The official reports claimed the dig was suspended due to structural instability. The ministry issued a statement thanking the research team and promising a future return when conditions allowed. But there would be no return. The shaft was sealed with poured concrete. The team was dispersed. Dr. Bennu was said to have taken a teaching post in Canada. Others simply vanished. I watched it all unfold online from a rented room in Cyprus, the articles growing fewer and quieter until the whole thing faded behind newer headlines. The disc is still there, or maybe not. I've come to understand it doesn't need to be in any one place. The thing we called an artifact was only a medium like ink, like film. What mattered was the pattern.
And once you've seen it, once it's played through your mind, it doesn't need repeating. It continues. That's why I've stopped trying to share the evidence. Every attempt to tell someone ends the same way. The recordings distort.
The files vanish. Even this journal, the one you're hearing now, isn't safe. I've written it by hand, duplicated it in audio, encoded it in old formats no one uses anymore, and hidden copies across 3 continents. It won't stop them, but maybe it will slow them. Maybe someone will read this before their thoughts begin to change. You'll know it's happening when the dreams stop feeling like dreams. When your memories begin to include places you've
never been, people you've never met, and languages no one speaks aloud. That's how it begins. Not with fear, but with familiarity. And then one day, without meaning to, You'll say something that isn't yours, a phrase, a name, a history, and you won't question it. You'll believe it always belonged to you. That's the part no one warns you about. Not the rewriting, but the acceptance. I'm not trying to stop the signal anymore. I know better.
But if you've listened this far, maybe you'll do what I couldn't. Maybe you'll remember which memories are yours. And maybe, just maybe, you'll still have time to forget the ones that aren't. The carvings didn't just depict healing rituals, they mapped out how to dream with purpose. I first saw the images carved into the inner sanctum of the Temple of Sefekre in Luxor. They were older than most hieroglyphic records, tucked away behind a sealed chamber that hadn't been touched in centuries. I wasn't a historian, not in the traditional sense. I'm a clinical psychologist. Trauma and memory recovery are my domain. But Egypt was something I returned to every few years. Part fascination, part escape. This time, I joined a small grant-funded project exploring the symbolic links between ancient rituals and modern neuropsychology. What I found wasn't symbolic at all. The temple was quiet in that thick, velvet way only sandstone can hold. Our guide, Amal, led us through a corridor barely wide enough to fit a single person. At the end was a wall of etched symbols, curved like breath, not written like words. No guards, no signs, just still air, cracked stone, and silence. The pattern made me pause. It was too structured, too rhythmic. And something odd happened as I ran my fingers along the sequence. Something hummed, not loudly, but under my skin, like standing too close to a tuning fork. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear. It was something else. Like my body remembered a sound it couldn't place. I dreamt of stone corridors filled with soft gold light. I dreamt I was being watched, but not unkindly. I woke up with a question stuck in my throat. What were these rooms actually built for? The next day, I stayed behind while the others continued down the excavation trail. I studied the carvings alone, photographing, translating, tracing them onto paper. They weren't just decorative, they were instructions. Each line paired with depictions of oils, herbs, and postures, bodies lying in rest beneath open, star-shaped ceilings. These weren't tombs, they were dream chambers, ancient sleep therapy sites built to channel some deeper process. But the last carving caught me off guard. A figure lying in sleep with a small stone jar held just beside their head. A thin thread etched from the figure's forehead into the jar's lid. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew this wasn't a metaphor. The first night I tested the ritual, I didn't tell anyone. I gathered the ingredients from the market in Luxor: blue lotus oil, crushed myrrh, dried chamomile, and something called kemet bark, sold discreetly in a brown pouch with no label. Amal helped me locate a room that matched the temple's original. Chamber dimensions: rectangular, narrow, with high ceilings and no windows. We stripped it bare, no electronics, no metal. I burned the herbs slowly, letting the smoke rise toward the ceiling's curved apex. At the head of the room, I placed a sandstone jar I'd bought from a vendor who claimed it had been recovered from an old tomb. It looked almost exactly like the one carved into the temple wall. As the room filled with warmth and scent, I recited the phonetic phrases I had translated earlier, though I wasn't sure what they meant. They didn't sound like prayers, more like rhythms, tonal instructions. My heart beat slower as I lay on the woven mat, arms at my sides, eyes closed. The room felt quieter than it should have, not silent, hollow. And in that space, something opened. I dreamt again, but differently this time. There were no fragmented flashes or surreal juxtapositions. This was structured, deliberate. I stood in a corridor lined with golden light, just like the ones in the temple, and at the end a figure was waiting. Not human exactly, not threatening either. Its face was smooth, unfinished, like it was still being remembered. I tried to speak, but found I couldn't. Then I noticed something. I was holding a jar, sandstone, smooth, sealed. And I knew at that moment I wasn't meant to open it. When I woke, the air in the room was still heavy with scent. But the jar, the real one, the one at the head of the room, had shifted. It was now resting on its side, as if nudged gently. I hadn't touched it. No one else had been in the room. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been dreaming at all. Maybe the ritual had worked, but how? The patients I was treating for trauma and repressed memory back in Zurich. What if this wasn't a method for healing? What if it was a method for extraction? I began cross-referencing the carvings with medical papyri from the same period, fragments from the Abers and Edwin Smith texts, mostly dismissed by modern scholars as primitive symptom logs. But I wasn't looking for symptoms. I was looking for processes, for anything that matched the sequence I'd uncovered in the temple. Over a week, a pattern emerged. Each sleep ritual was preceded by a purging mixture, followed by incense composed of specific resins, then a guided trance. Not guided by a priest, but by the structure itself. Room angles, temperature, scent saturation, sound resonance. They engineered the environment to induce a specific cognitive state. What struck me most were the afternotes scribbled into the margins of some translations. Words like loss, release, hollowing. These weren't just healing rites. They were procedures designed to isolate a memory, particularly one causing distress, and relocate it. But relocate to where? That's when I found the translated name of the sandstone jar, Nebu Seth, loosely vessel of dissonance, a container for a fragment of the self too sharp to keep. I wasn't sure what disturbed me more, the possibility that this had worked, or the suggestion that someone had once made it work so well they turned it into doctrine. I reached out to a colleague in neuropsychology discreetly. I told him I was developing a controlled dissociative therapy using guided ritual sleep. I left out the parts about the temple and the jar. I asked if he had seen any analogues in modern cases. He called me back the next morning, his voice hushed. He said he'd seen scans of patients, normal structurally, but with clear experiential voids, as if entire formative memories had been excised cleanly, leaving no trace in language, emotion, or dream recall. It's like something took the scaffolding away, he said, but left the building standing. I didn't tell him what I'd found in the bottom of my jar that morning. A single grain of black sand, dry and cold to the touch, resting in the center like a forgotten period at the end of an unwritten sentence. I held it between my fingers and felt nothing. No memory of the dream. No recall of what the figure had shown me. Only the shape of an absence pressed into my thoughts like a thumbprint. I returned to the temple under the pretext of continuing my translation work, though by then I was no longer interested in language. I wanted to see the chamber again, this time with intent. Amal hesitated when I asked for access alone, but he relented, warning me not to touch anything inside. The room was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had simply outgrown its stillness. I stepped in slowly, careful not to disturb the powder-fine sand covering the floor. In one corner, partially hidden by a fallen slab, I saw the edge of another carving. I crouched and swept the sand away gently, revealing a sequence of images, unlike the others. These weren't serene. They were frantic. A figure lay in the sleep posture. Beside them, a second figure held the Nebu-Seth jar. But it was the third that stopped me. A shadowed form, etched with less precision, emerging from behind the wall, not fully shaped, like it wasn't remembered clearly, or wasn't meant to be. My mind reached for interpretation, but only one word surfaced. Witness. Not a guardian, not a threat. Just something that was always present when the jar was filled. The final carving in the sequence showed the sleeping figure standing, eyes open but their shadow was gone. I traced the edge of that final figure with my hand and felt something give. A hollow tone rang beneath the stone. I pressed harder, and a thin seam opened beneath the carving. It wasn't deep, maybe 2 inches, but inside was a recessed niche, and in it a row of small jars, 8, all identical to mine, each sealed, each labelled with a different glyph. One had a faint fingerprint pressed into the dust on its lid. Not ancient. Recently. I didn't open any of them. I couldn't. But I stared at them long enough to feel their weight. Each one of those jars had held a person's unspoken truth, and whoever had placed them here recently was still following the old instructions. I stepped back, heart pounding in that slow, delayed way fear sometimes arrives. These weren't artifacts, they were records, memories removed, not lost, buried here like offerings. But to whom? I left the chamber without touching anything else. That night, for the first time in years, I dreamt of a memory I didn't recognize myself. In a room with no doors, whispering a name I've never known. I flew back to Zurich without ceremony, no goodbyes, no field reports. I packed only what fit in my carry-on and left the jar behind, hidden beneath the floorboards of a rented flat.
Near the Nile, I told myself I was done.
But back home, my practice felt strange, brittle somehow. The patients were the same, trauma, repression, recovery. But I no longer believed the mind was meant to heal in the ways we forced it to. I watched them speak around their pain, heard, the same metaphors repeated, a hole I can't describe, a fog that never lifts. It's like something was taken from me, and all I could think about was the temple, the jars. I started recreating the ritual privately. I mapped my office to match the proportions of the chamber, adjusted the lighting, the acoustics, even installed custom ventilation to carry the scent of lotus and myrrh. I told myself it was a mindfulness experiment, a sensory control study, but deep down I was testing something else. I selected a patient named Leon, mid-30s, severe insomnia, recurring nightmares involving a man standing at the foot of her bed, watching but never moving. She was exhausted, desperate for relief. I modified the ritual to fit clinical standards. I recorded consent. I supervised her sessions directly. By the third night, something shifted. She didn't dream of the man anymore. She didn't dream at all. And when she woke, she cried, not out of fear, but confusion. "It's like he was never real," she whispered. But I know he was. I reviewed the overnight logs. No anomalies. But the temperature in the room had dropped 5 degrees between 2:14 and 2:17 a.m., a detail the system didn't alert for because it corrected itself within 60 seconds. That morning, I found a grain of black sand in the corner of the therapy room nestled between the floorboards. Just one. Identical to the one that had appeared in my jar. I didn't know if it had always been there, if I was only noticing it now because I expected to. I touched it. Cold, textureless, meaningless unless you knew what had been taken. And somehow, I did. I didn't sleep that night. The jar remained empty, but I kept staring at it as if something might return. I no longer believed I was the only one testing the ritual. That thought had taken root. There were others, some careful, some careless, leaving behind more than memories. A few days later, Ava requested a meeting. She didn't explain why, but from the tone in her message, I knew she wasn't coming to talk about therapy. Eva didn't waste time. She closed the door behind her and handed me a flash drive without a word. On it were scans, photos, shipping manifests, jars, dozens of them. Some are sealed, some opened, all matching the Nebu Seth design. "The collectors think they're ceremonial," she said, "but a few have learned how to use them, quietly, selectively." She paused. "There's a demand." I asked what she meant, and she didn't blink. "There are people who will pay anything to forget, not through therapy, not gradually, completely. One night, one ritual, and it's gone. A divorce, a crime, a name, whatever burdens them, the jars take it." I asked what happened to the contents. She looked away. "That's the part no one agrees on. Some think the jars store them permanently. Others believe the memories degrade, but a few of us, we think they're absorbed." I didn't want to ask what. She reached into her bag and placed a small, sealed container on my desk. Identical to the one I'd left behind in Egypt. This one came from a man in Marseille, former intelligence, paid 300,000 euros to erase 2 years of his life. It worked. He doesn't remember the war, but he's not the same. I asked why she brought it to me. Her answer was simple. Because it's starting again. People are reporting sightings. Shapes in the corners of rooms. Missing time. Emotional voids that don't respond to treatment. The jars don't just take memories. They make room for something else. I closed my practice 2 weeks later. No statement, no transition plan. I simply stopped. Patients were referred out, files encrypted and archived. The only thing I kept was my journal, handwritten notes, sketches of the temple walls, fragments of dreams I couldn't fully recall. I moved into a quiet apartment above a print shop, changed my number, left the city in pieces behind me. But the stillness didn't follow. I began waking at odd hours, always 3:17 a.m., with the sensation that someone had just stepped out of the room. I never saw anything, but I started noticing subtle changes. Light switches flipped, a shift in air pressure. My reflection was delayed by a half-second, like the glass was remembering me before I did. And the dreams returned, but differently now, not symbolic, instructional. Each one ended the same way, a room with no windows, a table, a jar at its center, and a quiet voice asking a question I could never quite hear. I started keeping a jar by my bedside, not to use it, just to watch it. But one morning, I woke to find it open, empty. The lid placed carefully beside it, as if whatever it once held had completed its purpose. I don't remember dreaming that night. I don't remember much of anything from that week. When I asked Eva if there had been any new reports, she didn't respond with data. Just a message. They're not collecting memories, they're building something from them. I no longer know what parts of me are original. There are gaps in my own history that feel too clean to be natural, edges smoothed like a stone rubbed down by time. But I don't feel broken. I feel hollowed, streamlined, as if something that once took up space inside me has been relocated to make room for whatever comes next. I've stopped trying to recover what I've lost. That's not the story anymore. The real question, the one I carry now, quietly, like a sealed jar, at the back of my mind, is this. If the ancients believed healing meant extraction, then what exactly were they trying to survive? I'm not afraid of forgetting anymore. I'm afraid of remembering why. The irrigation still worked, even after thousands of years. That's when I knew this wasn't a ruin. It was a warning. We weren't looking for Atlantis. We were looking for signs of ancient trade routes buried beneath the Sahara, old salt roads, caravan paths, maybe a collapsed granary or two. The Richat structure had always been a geological oddity to most, a bullseye carved into desert stone, but to our small team of archaeologists, it was just a landmark we'd used to orient our survey drones. I remember the moment the ground-penetrating radar returned that first anomaly, a symmetrical pocket about 10 meters beneath the southern rim, perfectly circular, with patterns too regular to be natural. We thought maybe a chamber, maybe a burial site. What we found was something else entirely. The sand gave way too easily, almost like it had been disturbed before. And beneath that, stonework. Smooth, pale marble walls, dry but spotless. We expected bones, maybe old tools. Instead, we found gardens, underground, rows of vibrant green moss and flowering plants in tiered beds that stretched like amphitheatre seating beneath a ceiling that reflected sunlight from some unknown source. I stood in the cool air of that hidden biome, hand resting on an ancient irrigation pipe still pulsing gently with water, and I didn't feel wonder. I felt disoriented. None of it made sense. The air was oxygen-rich. The temperature was perfectly regulated, not a trace of dust. And most unsettling of all, the plants, some species I didn't recognize, seemed to respond subtly to movement, shifting their leaves like they were listening. At first, we assumed it had to be a trick of biology, some long-forgotten hydroponic experiment by an ancient Berber civilization, but even our most optimistic estimates couldn't explain the precision of the engineering, or the fact that the system was still working. That night, camped above the site under a sky that felt too quiet, I reviewed the footage again. One of the surveyors had panned across the far wall of the garden chamber, catching something I'd missed, a low stone table with a single artifact resting on its surface. A black tablet shaped like a disc, etched with concentric circles. Around, it were strange symbols, none of which matched known scripts. But the strangest part wasn't the writing. It was that when the light hit it at the right angle, the disc shimmered like it was vibrating, dreamlike. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did most of the team. We thought we were making history, but in hindsight, we were stepping into someone else's memory. We waited 3 days before we touched the disc. Long enough to rule out known hazards, but not long enough to quiet the pull it had on everyone who saw it. I watched the footage a dozen times, zooming in frame by frame. When our lead technician finally picked it up, with gloves, carefully, it emitted a low, almost imperceptible tone. Not loud, but present, like the hum of a fridge you only notice when it stops. We scanned it for radioactivity, magnetic fields, anything. It came back clean. But later that night, after logging the data and securing the object in a sealed case, I caught her sitting alone in the tent, watching the footage on loop. She didn't say anything, but her fingers kept hovering near her temple, like she was trying to remember a dream that wouldn't quite resolve. Back in our makeshift command trailer, I ran the high-res scans through image software, looking for known pattern matches. At first, nothing. But when I layered the etchings with a contrast map of the Risha structure itself, something clicked. The tablet's rings aligned perfectly with the geological formation's concentric circles, down to the spacing, angles, and even the minor distortions caused by centuries of erosion. It wasn't just similar. It was a key. A week earlier, I would have laughed at that idea. But now, with the footage playing in slow loops on my monitor, and the sound of trickling water still echoing from the chamber below, it didn't seem impossible. A sub-layer of inscriptions nearly invisible to the naked eye appeared under infrared. They weren't random, they were coordinates, embedded not as latitude and longitude, but as pulse sequences, binary intervals, precise and recursive. We fed them into our drone routing software. The location it returned was less than 600 meters northeast, beneath what looked like a collapsed dune ridge. No visible entrances, no signs of excavation, and no reason for us to believe there. Was anything there? Except the code. We sent the ground team the next morning. What they found wasn't an entrance. It was a platform, circular, just under 2 meters across, ringed with a stone lip that mirrored the tablet's outer edge. The moment the case carrying the disc crossed onto it, the sand around the lip began to sink, slow, deliberate. It wasn't a collapse. It was a mechanism, one designed to recognize its own artifact even after 1,000 years. The shaft beneath the platform wasn't deep, maybe 10 meters, but it led into something older than any structure we'd ever mapped. Air inside was still and cool, filtered through narrow channels that seemed engineered for breath itself. The walls were smooth, not carved, as if the stone had formed around an idea instead of a tool. And at the far end of the passage, we found a chamber that changed everything. It was circular, lined with alcoves, and each alcove held a stone slab, etched with concentric symbols, each slightly different, like variations on a song. In the center was a raised dais and a reclining stone figure, serene, mouthless, eyes closed. At first glance we thought it was a burial, but there were no remains, no offerings, and the body wasn't carved in mourning. It looked peaceful, like sleep. We documented everything, carefully, methodically, but the deeper we looked, the less this place resembled a tomb and the more it felt like a kind of threshold. That night, I started researching concentric iconography and came across something strange in a French colonial archive. Notes from a 1911 expedition that had gone missing near the same region. Their final entry described a cité sans parole, a city without speech, where the people communicated through shared dreams. The term was dismissed as poetic nonsense by later scholars, but the handwriting was shaky, and the last page was unfinished. The date matched a period of unexplained seismic silence in the Richard region. No winds, no storms, no human activity logged for months, as if the desert itself had held its breath. I cross-referenced the account with modern satellite scans and found irregular heat signatures radiating from beneath the structure we'd uncovered, spaced evenly, pulsing faintly in patterns that mirrored rapid eye movement cycles. REM, like sleep. I showed the data to our geophysicist, who stared at it too long before saying, "Whatever built this didn't vanish, they went inward." The tablets weren't just historical, they were functional, and they weren't written to be read, they were designed to be entered. That night, the technician who first touched the disc reported vivid dreams of a glowing city beneath waves of sand, where voices hummed through light and time had no direction. She said it felt like someone else had let her in. We returned to the chamber with new tools, not to dig, but to listen. Ground microphones, thermal scanners, vibration sensors, every instrument tuned to detect movement, flow, or signal. What we found instead was rhythm, a low, slow pulse beneath the stone, spaced evenly like a resting heartbeat. It matched the tablet's frequency exactly. The pulse was coming from a sealed corridor behind the reclining statue, one we hadn't noticed before because the seam wasn't visible until we scanned for moisture. When we pressed our hands to the wall, the surface didn't give way, it evaporated. That's the only way I can describe it. 1 second it was solid, the next we were looking into a hallway lined with smooth metallic panels, etched with more concentric designs, each more intricate than the last. We stepped inside carefully. The temperature dropped, but not to discomfort. The air felt intentional, engineered for calm. The corridor led to a domed room, not large, maybe 5 meters across, with a single circular bench carved directly into the floor and 6 stone headrests evenly spaced around it. We assumed it was ceremonial until one of the interns, exhausted from the day's work, sat down casually, resting her head back against one of the stone supports. Her eyes closed within seconds. No response. No distress. Just gone, like sleep had been waiting for her. No convulsions, no distress. Just gone. We rushed to her, checked her vitals. All normal. Her brain activity, though, was not. The EEG monitor we clipped on showed REM within seconds, dreaming, intensely so, with patterns that looked like language. She woke up 9 minutes later, eyes wet, saying only one thing: "They're still there." We ran tests all day and rotated team members through the bench, each reporting the same phenomenon: shared environments, dream cities with impossible geometry, and voices that didn't speak in words but in presence. Every vision included the same landmark, a massive circular city with tiered rings and waterways that mirrored the Rishat structure precisely. But none of them saw ruins. They saw movement, light, gardens that breathed. They described the inhabitants as tall, expressionless and silent, but not lifeless. The figures observed, listened, and welcomed. No one reported fear. Only the overwhelming feeling that time didn't work the same way there. We were no longer uncovering a past. We were entering a system that had never shut down. The first vehicle arrived just after sunrise, an armored SUV with no plates and windows too dark to see through. Within the hour, 2 more followed, along with a low-flying drone that circled the dig site in a slow, deliberate pattern. Our research coordinator, Dr. Kellerman, said not to worry. They were with our financial backers here for a progress update. But no one ever mentioned backers before. And whoever they were, they didn't come with notebooks or lab gear. They came with silence, suits, and satellite phones. A man who introduced himself only as Mr. Aylin requested full access to our equipment files and artifacts. He spoke calmly, never raised his voice, and always smiled, but his badge didn't match any known agency, and the way he moved through the camp made it clear we were no longer in charge. The disc was taken within the hour, so was the headrest, from the chamber, and every sensor log from the last 5 days. They copied our hard drives, disabled our satellite uplink, and asked us not to leave the perimeter without written clearance. "For your safety," they said. The technicians complied. Most of them were grad students with little experience navigating high-level interference. I tried to object, citing academic protocol and international research laws, but Aylin only nodded and said, "This site is now designated classified under joint jurisdiction. Continued cooperation will ensure your team's future." That night I slipped into the command trailer and powered up a secondary system we'd kept offline, a redundant data set, unofficial but intact. I uploaded a compressed version to a secure cloud account I'd created months earlier out of habit, not paranoia. But by now the two felt indistinguishable. Before dawn, 2 more team members were escorted off-site for routine debriefing. They didn't return. When I checked the living quarters, their tents were already gone. Cots, notebooks, even personal items cleared out, as if they'd never been there. The dream sessions had been halted entirely. Aylin's team said they were reviewing safety protocols, but I overheard one of their agents mention containment thresholds and neural overlap concerns. We weren't just being silenced, we were being quarantined. That's when it became clear we hadn't found Atlantis. We had triggered something still watching from beneath it. I stayed up that night, unable to sleep. Something about the way the agents avoided the northeastern ridge bothered me. It was as if they feared it, not just concealed it. At dawn, I walked the perimeter. That's when I saw the sand near the platform, disturbed but not by wind. Something had moved. 2 nights after the site was locked down, I was pulled from my tent by one of the original surveyors, Malik, who hadn't spoken a word since the agents arrived. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, but his steps were deliberate. He led me without speaking to the northeast ridge, back to the platform where we first found the shaft. Except now the platform wasn't just a circle of stone, it had opened. A spiral ramp now descended where there'd been nothing but rock. No one had seen it happen. No alarms were triggered. No surveillance captured the change. It had revealed itself silently, like it had been waiting for the right signal. I followed him down without hesitation. At the base the air shimmered. There were no lights, yet I could see clearly. Walls of stone and metal curved around a chamber, much larger than the first, with no visible seams. In the center hovered a sphere, dark and smooth, like polished volcanic glass. It didn't float. It hovered the way heat does, pulsing gently with a blue shimmer from within. It wasn't clear if it was technology, biology, or something older than both. Malik stepped toward it, eyes fixed, and the moment his hand touched the surface, his body went still. Then slowly he began to speak. Not in his voice, not in any voice I recognized, but in a layered, harmonic tone that carried emotion more than meaning. The words didn't come to my ears. They arrived directly in my thoughts. They showed me the city, not a ruin, not lost, thriving, not with movement or industry, but with a quiet, lucid order, as if time itself had been tamed, beneath perception, beneath time. A civilization that had realized the mind could become a habitat. That speech was unnecessary when dreams could be shared like rooms. They hadn't died. They had departed. They had left the surface not to escape destruction, but to preserve purity, to continue existence in a form the body couldn't follow, only the mind. The sphere pulsed brighter, and for a moment I saw them. Hundreds of them, standing in the city of rings beneath lightless skies, their faces calm, waiting, not with urgency, but with certainty. I was given a choice: stay and forget, or follow and remember. I pulled Malik away. He resisted at first, then collapsed. I carried him back up the ramp. No one stopped us. The guards were gone. The perimeter lights were off. By morning, the platform was sealed again, as if it had never opened. But Malik still speaks in dreams. And now, so do I. I left the site under the pretense of medical leave, escorted quietly and without ceremony. No questions, no paperwork. Just a final nod from Aylin and a warning: the dreams are not yours to share. It's been 9 months since then. I no longer receive updates from the team, what remains of it. The university contact stopped. Responding, our digital archive was wiped, and the cloud backups I made were corrupted within a week. The research fund was dissolved. The site was reclassified as a geothermal survey zone, with satellite imagery replaced by doctored terrain.
Renders, but the dreams haven't stopped, not for me. Not for Malik. He lives in near silence now, housed in a private facility in southern Spain, under the care of a non-profit that doesn't exist on paper. I visit him twice a year. We don't speak out loud anymore. We don't need to. The city
shows itself in flashes, still vibrant, still inhabited. In dreams, I walk its paths. I sit by its canals. I listen to the hum of thought that moves like wind through crystal. The Atlanteans, if you can call them that, are not ancient. They are current, continuous. Their bodies are gone or perhaps restructured into something non-material, but their minds are alive, shared in a closed loop that pulses just beneath our waking world. I've started mapping the rhythms again, quietly. I see fragments of the pulse hidden in seismic data, in the intervals of REM patterns from volunteers who don't know what they're part of. And in some cases I see recognition, small, subtle responses that suggest the city is still listening for minds capable of joining. I no longer seek proof. There's nothing to prove to anyone who hasn't felt it. This was never about discovery. It was about returning. The Rishal wasn't a ruin, it was a beacon. And we didn't find Atlantis, we reactivated it. The dreams come more easily now. I write them down not to remember, but to leave a trail for someone else in case I can't come back. One day soon, I'll stop waking up. And when that happens, don't look for me. I won't be missing. I'll be where they are. I'll be home. Sometimes I wonder if we were ever meant to find it. Or if the signal was always part of us, waiting for a mind open enough to answer. Maybe that's what Atlantis really was, not a place in the world, but a way of seeing it. I wasn't expecting the pyramid to answer back when I clapped, but then it did, like it had been waiting. I first visited Chichen Itza as part of a consulting gig, hired by a boutique sound architecture firm out of Mexico City. They wanted a digital acoustic map of the Kukulkan Pyramid, the kind of high-res, multi-layer sound model used in modern concert halls. For me, it was a technical puzzle. The angle of the limestone steps, the way the terraces stacked, the open courtyard, it all hinted at deliberate sonic behavior. Nothing supernatural, just clever design. But that changed the second I stood at the base of the pyramid and gave a single, casual clap. You've probably seen videos, how a single clap bounces back as a strange chirp, sharp and quick, like a bird call. But what struck me was the precision. I moved 5 feet left, and the echo changed pitch. A few more feet, and it changed again. It was too specific to be an accident. That first day, I stayed late. The tourists thinned out, the sun dipped low, and I kept experimenting. By dusk, I'd mapped 5 zones around the pyramid, where certain clap patterns produced not just echoes, but tonal responses. It felt musical, intentional, like knocking on a wall and hearing someone knock back. I logged the data, filed a preliminary report, and figured the firm would be thrilled with the novelty. But a week later, I got a call, not from the firm, but from a man named Louis, who claimed to be a local historian. He said he'd read my notes somehow and wanted to show me something the guides won't talk about. We met at a roadside cafe the next morning. Luis was older, quiet, and wore a straw hat that shaded most of his face. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and pointed to a diagram. It was the Kukulkan Pyramid, but annotated, covered in hand-drawn symbols and lines that looked like musical notation. He tapped the page with one finger. "They built it to sing," he said, "and not just for us to hear it." I didn't know what he meant, not yet. But that was the moment things started to shift, from a sound project to something else entirely. I spent the next 2 nights alone with my equipment, replaying and analyzing the echoes from every angle. My software showed that the pyramid's responses weren't just acoustic reflections, they were modified, shaped somehow by the geometry itself. Certain clap patterns, like 3 quick beats followed by a pause, produced elongated tones that decayed slower than they should have, ringing just faintly under the threshold of conscious hearing. I ran spectrographic analysis and found something I hadn't seen in natural reverberation. Harmonics that didn't align with the input signal. They were ghost tones, precise and layered, as if the pyramid had its own built-in filter bank, responding with musical intent. I published a private dataset to my firm's internal portal, hoping for feedback. It was viewed 4 times, downloaded once. 12 hours later, the file was gone. Not just deleted, retracted. I checked the logs. No trace of the download, no username attached. The next morning, Louise called again. "Don't upload anything."
"Else," he said flatly. "They don't like that." I asked who they were, but he only said, "You'll see." That night I returned to the site, hoping to record more data. I wasn't alone. A group of 6 people stood silently near
The base of the pyramid. No lights, no gear, just standing in a loose circle, facing inward, their shadows long against the stone. I stayed hidden. At exactly 2:13 a.m., one of them clapped 3 times, same pattern I'd tested days before. The echo returned, slower and deeper than I remembered. Then another stepped forward, turning slowly, arms raised, and began to move in sync with the sound. It wasn't dance, not exactly, more like a reenactment. Ritualized, careful. The rest followed, moving as a unit, in time with the pyramid's returning tones. I recorded everything from a distance, barely breathing. The echoes seemed to build in complexity, as if responding to the motion as well as the sound. The last clap lingered longer than it should have, nearly 5 seconds of a pure, humming tone. When it faded, the group dispersed silently, like it was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I went over the footage frame by frame. No electronics, no cues, just synchronized motion and impossible acoustics. One participant turned toward the jungle as they left. The camera caught it clearly. He smiled, but not at anyone in the group. He was looking into the trees. I didn't. Nowhere to start, so I went backwards. I stopped thinking like an engineer and started thinking like a researcher. If this wasn't new, if people had been using sound at Chichen Itza for generations, there had to be traces. I dug through archived anthropological field notes, most of them digitized decades ago, but rarely searched. It was slow work, cross-referencing, field work, from the 1930s through the early 2000s. I wasn't expecting much, just footnotes or sketches. But on the second day, buried in a scanned page from a 1956 excavation report, I found a passage that jolted me. The archaeologist described unusual tonal phenomena reported by local workers during reconstruction. The workers had referred to the echoes as las respuestas, not reflections, but responses. When I translated their notes more carefully, the word that kept appearing was contestado, as in answered. A few pages later, there was a hand-drawn map of what was labelled serpentine resonance zones, marked around the pyramid's perimeter, in a pattern that nearly matched the heat map I'd made from my own tests. The workers refused to stand in certain spots after dark. They said those areas remembered. I printed the page and pinned it to the wall above my laptop. Luis came by that evening, uninvited but expected. He didn't look surprised when I showed him the diagram. "It's older than that," he said quietly. "They found those tones carved into obsidian discs buried beneath the structure. 4 of them. I asked if they'd been analyzed, recorded, studied, anything. He shook his head. They were taken. No record now, just a mention. That night, I traced the diagram onto transparent film and overlaid it with my audio plots. The alignment was almost perfect. I added another layer, a satellite thermal scan I'd purchased a week earlier. The coldest zones matched the resonance.
Zones exactly. Places with no human traffic, no warmth. Like the structure was drawing heat inward, storing it. I stared at the composite for hours. The pyramid wasn't reacting to sound. It was responding to sequences. It had memory.
And if memory was involved, then this wasn't about architecture or tradition. It was about intention. Someone, long before us, had designed the pyramid to recognize patterns and answer. Luis took me deeper into the jungle the following night, far beyond the marked paths and tourist zones. We travelled by flashlight, then lantern, then nothing but moonlight. "It's better if we don't announce ourselves," he said. After 40 minutes of silence and dense undergrowth, we reached a clearing. At the centre stood the crumbling remains of what looked like a collapsed observatory, circular foundation, half-buried stone fragments, vines swallowing what was once deliberate design. "This wasn't built by the Maya," Luis said, kneeling beside a low wall. "At least not the ones who left glyphs. This was older, reused." He brushed away moss to reveal a polished panel, stone inlaid with a metallic mineral I couldn't identify. Embedded across its surface were circular patterns like grooves for a needle to follow or a record to spin. He handed me a small speaker, already wired with a contact mic. I pressed it to the surface. Nothing. Then I tapped the wall, 3 times, short, short, long, the same sequence from the pyramid. A faint vibration answered. Not a sound exactly, but a pulse. Luis closed his eyes. "It's the same signature," I whispered. "Exactly the same." He nodded. "There are 4 sites like this, all facing the pyramid, all buried, all ignored." I asked who knew. He shrugged. "A few archaeologists. One who disappeared. A government agency that sent men once and never came back. After that, no one talked." I didn't ask for proof. The wall was proof. The sequence was proof. We stayed until sunrise, mapping every
visible part of the ruin. In one corner, beneath a slab half covered in roots, I found a fragment of an obsidian disc. When I tapped it gently with a pen, the tone it produced was identical to the ghost harmonic I'd recorded near the pyramid. Identical pitch, identical decay. My hands shook. This wasn't a myth. This was engineering, deliberate, durable, advanced beyond anything attributed to its supposed era. And it wasn't isolated. These sites weren't just aligned. They were tuned, like a sound array, like speakers. Luis looked at me carefully. "You're not the first to notice," he said, "but you might be the first who's listened the right way."
By the time I returned to my hotel, my inbox had changed. There were 3 unread messages, none from known contacts. One was blank, just a single subject line. Stop mapping the tones. Another included an audio file, 4 seconds of low-frequency static that crashed my waveform software. The third was from an address that didn't trace back to any provider I recognized. It said, "The serpent doesn't echo, it responds." I deleted all 3 and disconnected from the internet entirely. That same night, someone entered my room. They didn't take anything, not even the disc fragment I had hidden inside a dismantled speaker. But they left something, a folded tourist. Brochure for Chichen Itza placed on my bed. The cover was circled in black pen. A single time, 2:13 a.m. I didn't sleep. I left early, drove hours to a friend's workshop in Valladolid, and transferred all my data onto 3 separate solid-state drives. I mailed 2 to different contacts I trusted, with no explanation, just a note that said, "Open only if I go silent." I kept the 3rd on me at all times. Meanwhile, Luis had stopped answering his phone. His messages went unread. When I returned to the jungle site, it was gone, not collapsed, cleared. The area had been raised clean, as if someone had used heavy equipment overnight. Even the vines were burned back, no footprints, no tire tracks, just exposed earth and silence. That's when I realized the rituals weren't just symbolic. The people around the pyramid, the ones I'd seen moving in sequence, weren't performing history. They were activating something, repeating a code, sound as input, presence as output. I couldn't tell who they were. Locals? Tourists? Academics? Or something else? But they were consistent. Every night at the same time, the sequence played out. I watched from different angles, different distances. I stopped recording. The last time I tried, my camera failed midway through. The battery didn't die, it melted. No heat, no warning. Just a soft whine and the smell of burned plastic. I was being watched. I wasn't the only one listening anymore. The pyramid wasn't just answering the sound, it was beginning to listen back. It happened on a Tuesday. The air was heavy, too still, as if the night were holding its breath. I hadn't planned to go back to the pyramid, but something in me shifted around midnight, a quiet pull I couldn't explain. I parked far from the site, followed the overgrown route I now knew by feel, and approached from the tree line. They were already there, more of them this time. 20, maybe more. Men and women in loose white garments, barefoot, spaced in a loose circle. No torches, no cameras, just the sound of the night. And then the clap sequence began. I stayed hidden, watched as they moved in perfect rhythm, repeating the same ritual I'd seen before. But this time, when the final clap rang out, something changed. The pyramid
answered, but the echo didn't decay. It held. A low, resonant tone filled the courtyard, deep and sustained, like a pressure in the air. I felt it in my chest before I heard it in my ears. The group stopped moving.
Slowly, in unison, they turned, not toward the pyramid this time, but toward the jungle behind them. And that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, feathered, not walking or moving, just there. standing between the trees, partially obscured by darkness but undeniably visible. It shimmered like heat above a road, its edges soft, its presence enormous. Every person in the group saw it. I know because they all reacted the same way. They knelt. No signal, no command. They just bowed. The tone from the pyramid shifted slightly like a chord resolving. And underneath it, unmistakably, I heard something, steady, deliberate, a breath, not wind, not imagination, actual, audible breath, moving with the rhythm of the tone. The figure raised one arm slowly, and I don't know why, but I understood the motion. It wasn't beckoning, it was acknowledging something ancient, something returned. At that moment, every resonance pattern I had mapped over weeks snapped into alignment. Every ghost harmonic, every carved disc, every ruined outpost, it all pointed to one conclusion. The pyramid wasn't passive, it wasn't designed to impress the living. It was a transmitter. And the rituals weren't stories, they were protocols. The tone faded slowly, almost reluctantly, and the figure vanished, not with motion, but by ceasing to be seen. The group dispersed silently back into the trees as if nothing had happened. I stayed in place for a long time, barely breathing, because now I knew. The serpent's call wasn't about remembering the past, it was about making contact. And something, whatever it was, had finally answered. I left Mexico the next morning. Not in a rush, not in fear, just with the understanding that my role had shifted. There was nothing more to collect on sight. The tones had spoken, the presence had answered. What remained now was reflection. I rented a small apartment in Merida under a different name, the kind of place where the windows stay open at night and no one asks questions. I kept the drives with me, the data, the recordings, the fragment of obsidian I still hadn't dared to test. I stopped trying to publish. Every attempt failed. Emails bounced. File uploads were marked as corrupt. One journal editor replied only once, "We don't run fiction. Please don't contact us again." I understood. The truth wasn't meant to be distributed. Not yet. Not like this. But something still reached me. Every night at 2:13 a.m., whether I was awake or not, I felt it. A subtle pressure in the walls, a hum beneath the silence. I stopped using audio gear. No more mapping, no more sampling. Now I just listened. And in the stillness, I began to recognize patterns, not in the sounds, but in their absence. Certain nights the tone would hold just a little longer. Other nights it would shift slightly, as if echoing a new shape. Once it matched a pattern I had clapped weeks earlier, perfectly, as if repeating it back. Not for study, for conversation. I've stopped trying to explain it to anyone. The few I trusted either went silent or looked at me like I'd drifted off course. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know the pyramid was never just architecture. It was always more. A coded vessel, a living sequence, a doorway. I think about Luis sometimes, about the way he said, "They built it to sing." He was right. But it wasn't a song for us. It was a signal, waiting for the right listener, the right response. And now someone, or something, is singing back. I've changed, though not in any way visible. more in how silence feels, how sound means something different now. The tones continue, patient and exact. I don't know what comes next, but I know the line has been crossed. Contact wasn't coming. It came, and I was there to hear it. We thought the stones at Göbekli Tepe were silent relics of the past until we mapped their frequencies and discovered they'd been singing to us all along. I didn't expect much from the trip. Honestly, I went because I needed a break from the lab's flickering lights and the kind of research that never left your inbox. Göbekli Tepe had always fascinated me. Those ancient monoliths older than agriculture itself, perfectly aligned, impossibly deliberate. But it was supposed to be a field observation, just a week of sun, data logging and local tea. That changed on day 3 when Emil brought out the laser vibrometer. He was half serious, trying to record how the wind moved through the stones for a sound design project he'd been tinkering with. I rolled my eyes but helped set it up. The wind that day was strong enough to catch through the gaps in the standing stones, and Emil's equipment picked up subtle harmonics, resonant frequencies too low for us to hear directly. Back at camp, he ran a basic spectrograph, and that's when we saw it. A repeating pattern across different pillars, each with a unique frequency, like tuning forks scattered across the hillside. I stayed up most of that night aligning the waveforms. They weren't just random. When sequenced by stone position, they followed a progression. Not just tonal, a rhythm, a cycle. Emil joked it sounded like a sleep loop. I couldn't shake the idea. That night, as rain fell on our tents and the wind passed through the stones, I listened again to the rough cut of the audio on my headphones. Despite the noise, I fell asleep faster than I had in months. When I woke up, I remembered a dream in full detail for the first time in years. I was walking through a wheat field, but the wheat was only waist-high, sparse and wild, and I wasn't me. I was watching the scene from inside someone else. That should have been the moment I started asking questions, but at the time it felt like a coincidence. Good night's rest, nothing more. I didn't know it yet, but we had just touched the edge of something preserved in stone, not as writing or ritual, but as vibration, a song. And we had just played the first few notes. Back in Berlin, the data kept pulling me back in. Emil uploaded the raw frequency recordings into a shared folder, casually labeling them Göbekli Harmonics. It should have ended there, another interesting artifact filed away and forgotten. But I couldn't stop thinking about the pattern. On a quiet Saturday morning, I ran the files through a sleep neuroscience model I'd helped develop years ago for a university project, an algorithm designed to sync auditory input with the brain's natural sleep stages. I didn't expect anything. But to my surprise, the software responded with a perfect match. The vibrations from Göbekli Tepe, when sequenced in a certain order, aligned almost exactly with the human sleep cycle. 12 hours from light drowsiness, through REM and back. The chance of that being random was infinitesimal. I tried it again with different sequencing rules, by height, by age of the pillar, even by the carvings on their surfaces, and one arrangement fit better than the rest. It formed a clean wave like a lullaby built into stone. I messaged Emil, "You're not going to believe this. The stones are playing a sleep program." he replied with a laughing emoji, then wrote, "Let's test it." Within a week, we had built a prototype. We called it the chamber, just an array of speakers, a dark room, and a precisely engineered playback of the pillar frequencies sequenced to follow the 12-hour waveform. The first night, we both slept in it. No EEGs, no
formal observation, just curiosity. I don't remember falling asleep.
I remember waking up hours later with the most vivid dream I'd had in my adult life. I was inside a circular village surrounded by low stone walls. People moved around me barefoot, wrapped in cloth, carrying baskets of roots and herbs. Their
hands were weathered, and their faces, God, I recognized them. Emil had the same dream, same village, same faces. We told ourselves it was suggestible, that our brains were just filling in the blanks together. But on the second night, the dream
continued. Same place, but now we were digging trenches, preparing the soil. I saw my own hands moving the earth, but they weren't mine. They were stronger, calloused, familiar in a way I couldn't explain. By the fourth night, we'd stopped joking about it. The dreams weren't just dreams. They were memories, or something wearing the shape of memory. And each night, we went further back. Before farming, before cities, before names. We brought in Annika, a cognitive anthropologist I'd worked with during a research grant in Tübingen. She wasn't the type to entertain wild theories which made her the perfect skeptic. We played her the waveform without explaining the source, just asked her to listen and then sleep in the chamber. She agreed, reluctantly. The next morning, she came into the kitchen, pale and quiet. "I had a dream," she said, like it was a confession. She described the same village, the same people. She'd carried water in a clay jar from a well near the edge of a forest, its trees thick and twisted like nothing that grows in Anatolia today. Emil and I didn't speak. We just let her finish. Afterward, she asked us where the sounds came from. When we told her, she laughed once, then stared at the floor for a long time. That day, she ran the tones through an ethnomusicological comparison tool usually used to analyze regional musical signatures. The software pulled a strange result, an incomplete match to a fragment of Paleolithic bone flute discovered in southwestern Germany, dated to 40,000 years ago. It wasn't an exact overlay, but the tonal spacing was eerily similar. We weren't hearing melody in the modern sense, we were hearing a sequence of resonances, tones selected not for aesthetics but for how they interacted with the human body. Anika pulled up records of burial sites with arranged stones, sound reflectivity patterns, and a theory she'd once dismissed, that early ritual spaces were designed for sonic effect. Göbekli Tepe wasn't just symbolic, it was acoustic architecture. But why a sleep sequence? Why induce dreams? The question hung between us for days. The three of us agreed on one thing. The dreams weren't random. They felt structured, sequential, like episodes. Annika started logging details, clothing patterns, food preparation, astronomical observations. Every element was consistent across all three of our dreams. Worse, we noticed ourselves in them more often, recognizing the gestures we made, the emotions we felt. These weren't dreams we were watching. They were lives we were inside. and each night they reached further back, like memory peeling away the layers of time. At some point, the line between dreaming and remembering blurred so completely we stopped trying to draw it. That's when Emil suggested the unthinkable. What if these aren't memories passed down genetically or culturally? He said. What if they're recordings? The room fell quiet. Because deep down, we had all begun to feel the same thing. We weren't dreaming of the past, we were reliving it. We needed to confirm the physical source of the tones, not the recordings, but the stones themselves. The sequence we'd used was based on Emil's earlier field scans, but we hadn't returned to the site since the chamber had started altering our sleep. So we went back. This time with a portable resonance mapping kit, field recorders, and a quieter purpose. The Turkish liaison granted us 5 nights of off-hours access under the pretext of acoustic preservation work. The dig site emptied at dusk. By 10 it was only us and the stars. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The stones remained silent under normal conditions, giving off only faint background tones when the wind is right. But on the 3rd night, we tested a theory. Emil recreated the exact waveform we'd used in the chamber and played it back through, a directional speaker aimed at the central ring of Pillar 43, the one carved with strange humanoid forms and vultures. What happened shouldn't have been possible. The stone responded, not in sound but in vibration. The surface shimmered imperceptibly under infrared light, its internal temperature shifting by less than a degree. Annika, watching through thermal imaging, whispered, "It's returning the signal." We ran the test again on different pillars. The ones with certain carvings, reptilian shapes, or what might be stylized eyes, responded most strongly. The rest stayed inert. It was as if some of the stones had been encoded and others had not. That same night, we noticed a buried structure outlined faintly in the ground-penetrating radar we'd borrowed from a nearby survey team. It wasn't on the official map. Circular, maybe 20 meters across, set beneath the eastern slope beyond the excavated rings. Annika cross-referenced old site plans and found a rejected proposal from the early 2000s suggesting a substructure there, dismissed due to geological interference. We didn't ask permission. We waited until the following night, brought our equipment, and hiked in through a dry channel. What we found wasn't a chamber. It was a depression filled with collapsed masonry and a partial ceiling slab. But at its center was something unmistakable, a single intact monolith, half buried, different in texture and color from the rest. Blackened stone, smooth like obsidian, and colder to the touch than the surrounding air. When Emil tested it with, the tone sequence, the ground around it vibrated, softly, rhythmically, in sync with the playback. Then for a moment, the sound looped back to us, not as echo but as harmony. The pillar was joining in, not a passive artifact but a participant. And that's when we understood we hadn't found a ruin, we had found a mechanism, and something inside it had just woken up. After the site incident, we agreed not to report the discovery. Not yet. The footage Emil recorded of the pillar's response was compelling, but we knew what it would trigger. Interference, shutdown, the end of our access. Annika suggested we reframe the data, submit it under a generic acoustic heritage label, and hold back the deeper findings It was a compromise none of us liked, but it bought us time. Back in Berlin, we kept sleeping in the chamber and logging every dream. The episodes grew longer, more vivid. One night I stood in a circle of figures, around a carved stone slab under open sky, our bodies moving in rhythm to a sound I couldn't hear, but could feel. Not celebration, synchronization, the vibration moved through us like breath. I woke with tears in my eyes, not from fear, but from recognition. Emil began waking up, shaken. "We've been here before," he said one morning, "and not just in dreams." At first I thought he meant figuratively, but then I saw what he meant. We weren't just observing the past anymore. It was observing us. I started noticing strange things. An email I didn't remember sending, a message thread with Emil containing words I hadn't typed. Annika received a call from a former colleague saying her name had appeared in an old military sleep study, one she'd never participated in. When she asked to see the file, it had already been scrubbed. There were nights we felt watched, even in the chamber. Emil found a background process on our workstation, quietly transmitting fragments of the waveform to an IP address in Ankara. None of us had configured it. We wiped the system and pulled the drive, but it was already too late. The next morning, our lab credentials were locked. The grants portal showed a 403 error. Calls to the Foundation rerouted endlessly. Someone
Knew, and they weren't stopping us yet. They were listening. The worst part wasn't fear.
It was the creeping realization that the closer we got to the source, the less our lives felt like our own. The dreams no longer waited for sleep. I would blink during the day and see flickers of that ancient world. Stone homes, wild fields, faces I knew before I was born. The sound was always there, just beyond hearing. We had activated something buried, not just in the earth, but in us. And we knew what came next. We had to share it, before it rewrote us completely. We released the audio online, disguised as a sleep loop. No names, no backstory, just a 12-hour waveform buried beneath ambient noise. It spread quickly. A few niche communities picked it up. Sound healing groups, lucid dreaming forums. We watched the responses. Within days, people began posting identical dream imagery. A field of wild grain, low stone homes, fires under an open sky. One user described a carved pillar and the hum beneath their feet. Another posted a symbol nearly identical to the one etched into the base of the obsidian monolith we'd uncovered, a symbol we'd never published. The dreams weren't just similar, they were synchronized, not imagined, replayed. Then came the takedown notices. First, an email citing intellectual property violations on audio we'd made ourselves. Then our account was deleted. Emil's laptop was remotely wiped. Annika's apartment was broken into. Nothing taken, just her notebooks disturbed. Some pages missing, others shuffled out of order. Whoever was watching wasn't just trying to stop us. They were managing the exposure, containing it. That night, Annika broke.
They're not trying to erase it, she said. They're protecting it, or preserving it, for something. I didn't have an answer. I returned home to find my front door open. Nothing was stolen, but the chamber setup had been altered.
Cables repositioned, speakers rewired. A new file was open on the workstation, playing on loop. Not ours. Slower, heavier. The spectrogram showed a new pattern, not just matching sleep rhythms. Predictive, the waveform aligned with our logged dreams, but not backward, forward. We were no longer replaying the past. We were rehearsing the future. In the final dream, I stood on a hill watching smoke rise over the field. The village was gone, and in my hand was a tool I had never seen, but somehow knew how to use. The tone played behind me like a memory waiting for its cue. Emile disappeared the next day, no warning, no trace, just a single message scrawled into the dust on his desk. Not reincarnation, repetition. Annika left a week later without a
word. I don't blame her. By then we understood the tones were never meant to be discovered. They were meant to be followed. I've stopped using my name. It feels like something from before. I rent a small flat near the coast where the ocean's rhythm still drowns out the low hum that never fully leaves me.
I haven't heard from Emile. If he's alive, he's disappeared more completely than I knew was possible. Annika sent one last message from an encrypted account. No greeting, just a line. Memory isn't backward, it's circular. I don't know what she meant exactly, but I feel it. The track is still out there, uploaded, mirrored, passed from inbox to inbox, no context, no warning, just a sound that feels safe to play while you sleep. The responses haven't stopped. Every week, more reports. People dream of the field, the fire, the faces. Some say they recognize themselves. A few say they wake up with memories they can't explain, skills, sensations, grief that doesn't belong to this life. I don't stop them. I don't interfere. We're past stopping it. The dreams have shifted. They're less like stories now, more like alignment checks. The grip of a stone
in my palm, the feeling of a wind that hasn't blown in centuries.
I don't know what Göbekli Tepe was, not exactly, not anymore. But I no longer believe it was a temple. I think it was a machine, a reminder, not of where we came from, but where we return when we've strayed too far. The tones were left behind to re-sync us when the pattern was broken. A reset. Not to teach, but to recall. And when enough of us remember, not just the dreams, but what they mean, I think something changes. I don't know what will happen next. But I think the stones do. They said I was only sleepwalking, but no one could explain why I kept drawing constellations that haven't been visible for thousands of years. I was 9 the first time I saw Stonehenge. My parents were chasing one of those slow travel blog dreams, filling memory cards with foggy landscapes and wild sheep on narrow roads. I didn't sleep much back then. Something about unfamiliar ceilings and the sound of distant wind always kept me half awake. We stayed in a rented cottage, a mile from the site, creaky and low-ceilinged, with thick walls that seemed to press back when you leaned against them. The first morning, my mother found a spiral traced into the window's condensation. She assumed I had done it without thinking. Maybe I had. But the next night, another one appeared, this time on the bathroom mirror. The third night, the spiral was outside, drawn in the thin frost on the car's windshield. That morning, my father noticed barefoot prints in the grass leading from the cottage toward the distant field. They matched mine. But I had no memory of leaving bed, no dreams I could recall. That was the first time I felt something strange wasn't ending when I woke up. It was beginning. I started sketching in my notebook during the drive home. Loops and arcs and lines that meant nothing to me, but felt right to draw. My parents thought I was going through a creative phase. I didn't tell them I couldn't stop. I drew in waiting rooms at the breakfast table, even once on the back of a napkin during a school trip. None of it looked like anything to me, just spirals and dots and empty space. But the more I drew, the more I started to notice the stars, not in a magical way, just familiarity, like I'd seen them before, like I was remembering, not imagining. No one thought much of it until a teacher submitted a few of my drawings to a local university's astronomy outreach program. A researcher called my parents 3 weeks later, asking to speak with me. Not about talent, about accuracy. The researcher's name was Dr. Mara Keane, and from the first moment of our video call, I could tell she wasn't trying to flatter anyone. She had that kind of quiet intensity that made my palms sweat. She asked to see my drawings in the order I'd made them, with any timestamps or scans we still had. Then she stopped speaking entirely, just scrolling, enlarging and comparing. Finally, she turned her screen and showed a simulation, an astronomical modeling program she used for research. She'd input the coordinates from one of my more complex spiral drawings. The model didn't match the modern night sky or even known constellations. But when she rewound the software more than 8,000 years ago, everything clicked. The arcs I'd drawn mirrored star paths from 6,000 BCE. Specifically, during the solstice cycle, I remember her voice going softer. These aren't guesses, they're corrections. I didn't understand what she meant at first. But things changed after that. My sketches were no longer seen as odd distractions. They became evidence. Internet, forums picked up the scans. Amateur astronomers started comparing them to paleo sky reconstructions and satellite data. A pattern emerged. My drawings were not just aligned with ancient skies, but with startling precision. Angles, spacing, even relative motion matched reconstructions of skies we couldn't see anymore. Then came a new wave of attention. Someone on a history forum matched one of my recurring spiral motifs to an engraving found in Brittany, a stone spiral that predated Stonehenge by centuries. Another thread connected it to a bone fragment in Eastern Europe. Always the same layout. Always a forgotten sky. I hadn't read about any of them. And yet I kept drawing them. The designs started surfacing at odd moments, on fogged windows on my school binder, once traced into the frost on my bedroom window from the inside. But something had changed. The spirals were no longer static. They were bending slightly, shifting into positions that didn't match past or future skies, like they were drifting toward something else. Something waiting. My father was the first to notice the deeper pattern. He wasn't a scientist, just a community college geography lecturer, but he had a knack for remembering details no one else cared about. One evening, while organizing a box of my sketchbooks, he pulled out a faded textbook on ancient European monuments and flipped to a diagram of a Neolithic passage tomb. He held it up beside one of my spirals, and the match was obvious. We started comparing more sites, chalk figures in the hills, spiral etchings in Ireland, burial stones in Orkney. The connections were uncanny. These weren't just decorative symbols, they were coordinated references. Dr. Keene verified it through her contacts and said something I didn't expect. These drawings aren't just aligned with ancient skies, they fill in gaps in the data we don't have. My sketches were somehow more complete than what science had reconstructed, more accurate. It wasn't just that I'd drawn what had once been seen. It was that I knew how it moved. That's when the National Antiquities Trust reached out. A man named Quinn came to our door with a weathered ID badge and a friendliness that felt rehearsed down to the syllables. He claimed his office collaborated with historical sites across the country, but when my father asked who he reported to, Quinn gave a non-answer, multiple agencies, and handed over a business card that only had a phone number, no website, no name. He asked a lot about my sleep, about how I felt when I drew, if I ever felt aware of time behaving differently. We didn't answer much, but later that week a courier arrived with a sealed envelope inviting us to a private viewing at Stonehenge during the winter solstice, officially for educational purposes. The letter didn't come from the trust. It came from a foundation we'd never heard of, with no digital footprint. We decided to go. I wasn't sure what I was going to see, but I had the feeling I wasn't going there to look at Stonehenge. I was going so it could look at me. The stones didn't feel ancient up close. They felt recent, like they had just settled in place, still humming from the weight of what they were built to hold. We met a guide named Isla, a polite woman in a dark coat with no last name on her ID. She said very little, just that we'd have the circle to ourselves for an hour. No recordings, no phones. The moment I stepped inside the ring, the air changed. Sound didn't vanish, but it flattened, like the wind was passing through us instead of around. I wandered toward one of the outer trilithons and placed my palm against it. It was cold, but there was a faint vibration beneath my hand, not just under the stone, but running up through my fingers into my wrist, a steady thrum, like feeling a heartbeat inside a wall. For a second, everything blurred. I didn't faint. I fell into something. The circle around me was no longer surrounded by tourists or fences, just grass, low firelight, and the stars, brighter and lower than they should have been. There were people there, not ghosts, not visions, just people, standing, watching, moving slowly in a silent loop through the stones, their expressions calm but focused. They were building something precise, not sacred, calibrated. When I stepped back, Isla was already beside me. She didn't look surprised. She handed me a folder with my name on it. Inside were radar scans, images of the ground beneath the circle. Most were empty, but one showed a hidden chamber carved deep into the chalk, aligned with a vanished star system only visible 8,000 years ago. I didn't need to study it. I'd already drawn that chamber 3 nights earlier, in my sleep. The house felt thinner every day, like walls weren't meant to hold what was happening anymore. My mother kept checking the windows twice. My father moved his laptop off the Wi-Fi and started printing articles again, like going analog could keep us out of reach. That night I dreamed of the buried chamber again. This time it was above ground, open, blazing with firelight under an ancient
sky. I wasn't a visitor anymore. I was inside it, standing in the spiral.
When I woke, there was a circle of ash on the floor beneath me. My hands smelled like smoke. My parents found it and didn't speak. They just started packing. We were moved without explanation, relocated by two men in grey jackets claiming to represent a private observational group. They never said where they were taking us. The building they brought us to looked like a weather station, but it wasn't. There were cameras in every room. A technician came each night with scanning gear, not to check me, but the room, measuring airflow, static, and micro changes in temperature. On the third night, a spiral of frost formed on the metal desk where I'd been sitting, identical to the spiral in my last dream. Dr. Keene sent one final encrypted message. An audio clip taken from a solstice event in 1997. It contained a tone repeating every 5 seconds, inaudible to the crowd but captured by seismic equipment. It matched the pattern in my drawings. Her last line read, "They're not tracking you, they're tracking what's moving through you." After that, her email vanished. Her name was pulled from the university site. We searched, but she was gone, like she'd never been there. I stopped sleepwalking, but only because there was nowhere left to go. Each night I stood in the chamber, now broken and open to a sky that felt heavier than space itself. Something was coming through. I could feel it, not as fear, but as completion. My drawings didn't appear anymore, they didn't need to. The pattern was already in the world, etched into frost, into mould, into wind. A spiral that was always meant to return. I wasn't its creator, I was its echo. One morning, all the clocks in the house were wrong by exactly 47 minutes, behind. That afternoon, my mother walked into the kitchen and froze. Every drawing I had ever made, hundreds of them kept locked in a chest, were gone. No signs of break-in. The lock is untouched. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the spiral's center and someone else stood at the edge. A figure, faceless, watching. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. I wasn't being pulled back in time. I was used to pulling time forward, to open it. The spiral wasn't a symbol, it was a mechanism, and I had turned it. They let us leave one morning without warning. The cameras were off. The building was silent. No one stopped us. No one said goodbye. My parents didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. We drove west, past the coast, into a quiet town where nothing moved too fast. We've lived here ever since. The dreams stopped. The spirals did not. I see them sometimes in how the trees bend during storms or in the migration patterns of birds that veer off course for no reason. I don't draw anymore. I don't have to. The spiral is already in motion, quiet and invisible. Time doesn't travel like a line. It circles back, waits, and then moves again when someone listens. I was just the one close enough to hear the turning. The carvings showed 2 moons, one we could see and one that doesn't exist on any map of the night sky. I didn't come to Belize looking for anything cosmic. I was there for the trees, the vines, the humidity that stuck to your skin like a second layer of clothes. My name's Owen Navarro, and I've spent the last decade photographing lost places for environmental studies. Temples swallowed by roots, cities crumbled under jungle weight. That's what brought me to the site near Lamanai, deep in the lowland rainforests. The locals had mentioned an unmapped structure not far from a dry riverbed, barely visible through satellite imaging. They called it the Quiet Temple. No myths, no gods, just quiet. It took 4 days to reach it. The machete worked the whole way. The temple was humble, almost boring from the outside. Half-collapsed steps, a worn facade of limestone slabs. But the interior was something else. A single chamber, no wider than a small cafe, opened into darkness, cut only by my flashlight. And that's where I saw it. On the ceiling, not the walls. A map. Not of Earth, not exactly. It showed a crescent moon, and beside it, a second satellite. Smaller. Sharper in shape. It had its own phases too, tiny etchings of crescents, fulls and shadows, all arranged in a progression. I assumed it was artistic, symbolic, but the longer I stared, the more accurate it felt. There were stars, aligned in unfamiliar patterns. One resembled the Orion belt, but tilted slightly, and another looked like Taurus. If Taurus had a twin to its left. Back at my tent, I tried to sketch it from memory, but I couldn't capture the geometry. Something about it resisted copying, like my mind wouldn't hold the proportions. I snapped photos, high-res, thinking I'd study them later. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft dripping sounds outside the tent, though it hadn't rained. At one point, my phone lit up on its own. Just a white screen. No notification, no signal. The next morning, my guide refused to go back. He said something had shifted overnight. Birds gone quiet. Trees leaning in ways they hadn't before. I stayed. I shouldn't have. I flew back to Merida 3 days early, bringing only my camera and a hand-drawn copy of the ceiling map. I told the research team the temple was mostly unremarkable, a collapsed outpost with some standard iconography. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. That night in my hotel room, I uploaded the photos and froze. The second moon, the one etched in such impossible detail above the altar, didn't appear in any of the pictures. The stars were there, the phases. But the second moon was missing, erased, as if it had never been carved. I scrubbed metadata, checked exposure settings, even ran image recovery software, assuming corruption or overexposure. But nothing explained it. The photos were pristine, just incomplete. That's when I turned to the Deep Sky forums. I posted a digitally redrawn version of the map under a pseudonym, asking if anyone recognized the stellar configuration. A few dismissed it as artistic liberty, but one user, someone going by Rhett Orbiter, messaged me privately. "You
Found the echo," they wrote. "Delete everything. Don't sleep near any reflective surface." I ignored the second part, thinking it was the usual cryptic nonsense people add to sound important. But the first part, that stuck with me. I asked what they meant by echo.
Their reply came an hour later, a zipped folder with 2 files, a satellite image from 1982 labeled Horizon Eastern, and a scan of a Mayan codex fragment from a private archive in Guatemala City. Both showed something eerily similar to the second moon, an orbiting body positioned on the opposite side of Earth's rotation, a gravitational twin. But the satellite data had been blacked out, coordinates scrambled, and the document's provenance was unverifiable. Still, the shape was the same, down to the craters, It wasn't just a design element. Someone else had seen it. Someone with equipment. I tried messaging Ret Orbiter again, but the account was gone. No history, no trace. That night, I dreamed I was back in the jungle. But the trees were all tilted, reaching toward the center of the sky. Not the moon, something behind it. When I woke, my laptop was open, a blinking cursor in the search bar. I didn't remember typing in. The words were simple, almost childlike. Which world are you in? I spent the next week buried in archives, chasing the second moon through anthropology journals and declassified observatory logs. I wasn't looking for confirmation. I knew what I'd seen. But for context, for anyone who might have documented it before. I found one credible mention in a paper from 1961 written by a retired NASA consultant named M. Reyes. It wasn't peer-reviewed and had quietly disappeared from citation indexes, but the PDF had survived on a Canadian university server. Reyes described an oppositional lunar mass that appeared only during certain eclipse alignments, always invisible to optical telescopes, only traceable through interference anomalies during lunar shadow transits. He believed it wasn't a moon in the traditional sense, but a gravitational echo, oscillating just behind the threshold of observation. I cross-referenced his data with the star alignments from the temple ceiling. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to make my stomach tighten. Then something stranger surfaced. Reyes had once consulted on a Cold War-era research station in Chiapas, an underground observatory used by both US and Mexican agencies during the 60s. It was reportedly shut down after a sensor malfunction during a total lunar eclipse. In 1964, the official report cited equipment failure. Unofficially, a technician had gone missing, and the logs from that night were sealed. But one image had leaked, a pencil rubbing from a carved wall inside the station. It matched the temple ceiling exactly down to the shape and tilt of the twin moons. These weren't independent discoveries, they were connected, repeating, each tied to specific lunar eclipses, each hidden, buried, or forgotten. I compiled everything. Reyes's paper, the leaked photo, the codex fragment from Ret Orbiter, and laid it out across my wall like a timeline. Patterns emerged. Every documented appearance of the second moon occurred during simultaneous lunar eclipses visible from both the Americas and Southeast Asia. They weren't random, they were synchronized. That's when I noticed something else. The next eclipse of that kind was in 5 weeks. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it made one thing clear. The temple hadn't recorded the past, it was predicting the next alignment, and I had to be there when it happened. The station was buried under decades of soil and silence, marked only by a rusted antenna half swallowed by vines. It took 2 days of hiking with a local fixer to find it, though he refused to go near once we spotted the collapsed entrance hidden beneath a layer of moss-covered stone. "Old military site," he muttered, standing back. Bad stories. I didn't ask for more. I thanked him and went the rest of the way alone. The hatch was welded shut, but erosion had cracked one side open just enough for me to slip through. Inside, the air was thick and metallic, tinged with mildew and the sterile scent of long-dead electronics. My headlamp cast a narrow beam across dust-coated terminals and analog consoles frozen in mid-operation. Everything looked paused, not abandoned. Coffee cups still sat beside chairs. A calendar on the wall, stopped in August 1964. No graffiti, no signs of looting. just layers of time settling undisturbed. I followed a narrow corridor to his secondary chamber, the walls marked with faded stenciling in both English and Spanish. Observation level. What I found there changed everything. The room had no windows, just a domed ceiling with a hatch that must have once opened to the sky. Beneath it, carved into the concrete, was a diagram almost identical to the one in the Mayan temple. Twin moons, overlapping paths, eclipse symbols, and something new. A line connecting both lunar bodies, arcing downward into what looked unmistakably like a human figure in a sleeping position. Not standing, not reaching, sleeping. Around the base of the figure were etched glyphs, some Mayan, others unrecognizable. But one symbol repeated, scratched deeper than the rest, a spiral with 2 dots at its center. I touched it, just out of instinct. The room hummed, not loudly, more like a pressure behind my ears, like when a plane descends too fast. My flashlight flickered. A low vibration started beneath the floor, so subtle I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. I should have been scared, but
I wasn't. It felt familiar, like stepping into a dream I'd forgotten I'd had.
then the dome above me shifted, only for a second. Just enough to reveal a thin beam of moonlight piercing through the decay. It hit the floor precisely on the sleeping figure. I didn't move. I let the light touch me. And for a brief, impossible
moment I felt weightless, like something was watching me from the other side.
I left the site before sunrise, climbing out through the broken hatch and sealing it behind me with a sheet of tarp and stones. I didn't know if that would matter. I just needed distance. Back in town, I tried to act normal, checked into a cheap hostel, ordered food I barely touched, and reviewed my footage on a burner laptop. The files were intact, but the sound was wrong. Every clip recorded inside the station carried a low-frequency hum, almost inaudible but constant. When I ran it through an audio visualizer, a pattern emerged, a soft, looping pulse with distinct breaks every 27.3 seconds. Not random, not ambient. It matched the transmission timing from Reyes's eclipse data, down to the decimal. I knew what that meant. The station wasn't just recording something. It had been waiting, broadcasting. And if that symbol really did represent a sleeping human, maybe that was the key. Not wakefulness, not action. Sleep. The portal, if that's what it was, required unconsciousness. I stared at my screen until the hum started to feel like it was vibrating inside my teeth. Then I shut the lid. I needed help, or at least corroboration. I sent an encrypted message to a woman named Elena Ross, an ethnographer I'd worked with once on a survey in Tikal. Trusted, sharp, and just paranoid enough to believe me.
I wrote everything about the temple, the missing moon, the map in the station, the symbol of the sleeping figure. I told her about the upcoming eclipse. I didn't ask her to believe me. I just asked her to look. She replied in less than an hour.
I've seen the symbol before, twice. Once in a codex from Yucatan, once on a burial mask in Guatemala City. Never published. I thought it was a funerary motif. But now I'm not sure. I'll come. That night, I booked a return trip.
To the temple site.
The coordinates still felt risky to send electronically, so we agreed to meet in person at a waypoint outside the jungle reserve. Before logging off, I checked my camera again, just once more. The last photo I took, inside the station, under the open dome, had changed. I didn't edit it. I didn't touch the file. But the floor beneath the carved figure now showed something new. My shadow, lying down, eyes closed, and a second moon hovering just above my chest. We reached the temple 2 nights before the wire eclipse. Elena had brought a thermal camera, infrared filters, and a weather-sealed sleep monitor, modified from one of her university's field labs. I brought only what I needed: a mat, a blanket, and the image of my own sleeping form etched into memory. The sky was cloudless. A full moon hung above the canopy like a silent clock, waiting. We set up camp just inside the chamber, directly beneath the carved ceiling. I lay down first. Elena calibrated the monitors, adjusting the position of a small EEG sensor clipped just behind my ear. "If anything changes," she said quietly, "I'll wake you." I nodded. Then I closed my eyes. What followed wasn't sleep in the normal sense. There was no drifting, no dreams, just absence, then immediacy. One moment I was listening to the chirp of insects, and the next I was standing in a place that wasn't made of stone or soil. It resembled the temple, but the angles were reversed. The ceiling was now the floor. The air shimmered like heat off pavement. Everything moved with a gentle rotation, as if the space itself was orbiting something. I looked up or down and saw her, another version of Elena, but inverted, like she had been painted in mirror light. She was watching me through a veil of motion, and she was afraid. Behind her was the second moon, suspended far too close to the surface, casting no shadow. It pulsed once, then again, and a line of glowing symbols appeared across the ground beneath my feet. The same spiral, the same 2 dots. I knelt beside them. When I touched the pattern, the rotation stopped. The air pulled inward. Then I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, layered like it was being spoken across water. "This is not your sky." I opened my eyes to find Elena shaking me. "You were gone," she said, her voice tight. "Only for a few minutes, but your temperature dropped 6 degrees, the EEG flatline, then it lit up with activity I've never seen outside seizure states." I sat up. I wasn't cold, I felt split, like part of me hadn't come back yet. On the camera's display was the infrared recording of the moment I touched the symbol. For one frame, just one, I was not alone. Another figure, identical in shape but featureless, had appeared beside me, kneeling, reaching out. We both knew what that meant. The portal wasn't a metaphor, it was literal, and the only way through was to sleep inside its map. We didn't go back the next night. Elena wanted to. She had the data, the footage, the kind of raw proof careers are built on. But something about the encounter, the precision of it, the timing, made me hesitate. It hadn't felt like an invitation. It felt like a test. I convinced her to wait until the eclipse. We returned at dusk, just as the moon's shadow began to spread across the temple floor. Everything was quiet. No insects. No wind. just the shifting geometry of light and time. I lay down in the same spot, aligning myself with the figure on the floor, the second moon now visible through a crack in the ceiling, dim but distinct. Elena stayed by the entrance with the thermal monitor running. As the eclipse reached totality, the chamber shifted again, same as before. No movement, no sound. Just absence, then clarity. I was back in that mirrored space, but this time I wasn't alone. Figures stood along the walls, motionless, watching. Not threatening, just there. They looked like people, but simplified, like silhouettes drawn in layers. One of them stepped forward and spoke without speaking. This is the axis between the skies. I understood without hearing. The temple wasn't a shrine, it was an instrument, a receiver between two synchronized
Earths. The second moon wasn't part of ours, it belonged to theirs.
And during the brief window of the eclipse when both skies dimmed at once, the line between them thinned, just enough to cross, just enough to see. I don't know how long I was gone. When I woke, Elena was crying quietly. "You stopped breathing," she said. For 43 seconds. I didn't tell her everything, not right away. Just that I saw something, and that it didn't want to be seen again. We packed in silence. On the way back through the trees, I noticed the light had changed, softer, more diffuse, like a filter had been laid across the world. I still carry that change with me. I don't dream like I used to. Sleep feels different now. Lighter, but also further away. Like I'm never fully alone when I close my eyes. We never published. The data. Elena keeps the files on an encrypted drive. I deleted my copy. But some nights, when the sky turns silver just before dawn, I see the spiral in my mind. 2 dots. One world awakens. One waiting. And I wonder if I ever really came back. If you dream in unison with others, be careful who is guiding the rhythm. I first heard about the codex from a conservator named Giulio, who spoke in whispers and always wore gloves, even in the summer. He handled centuries-old texts at the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, where temperature mattered more than theology. Giulio wasn't the type to embellish. He once corrected my Latin pronunciation with the patience of a funeral director. So, when he told me about a sealed folio misfiled under liturgical apocrypha, I didn't roll my eyes. He didn't call it by name. He just said it was wrong, quietly wrong, like music in a hospital room. That was enough to make me ask questions. I wasn't supposed to be there, of course. Visiting researchers don't get late-night access. But I'd spent the past 3 weeks transcribing Jesuit correspondences and had built up a sort of benign invisibility. Most guards nodded without checking badges. That night, Giulio handed me a slip of paper with the shelf code and walked away without another word. I found the folio behind a stack of baptismal inventories. Its binding was unadorned, blackened, leather that flaked at the corners. No title, no stamps, just a faint scent of frankincense and something chalky like limestone dust. Inside, the script was neat, but strange. Latin, yes, but with annotations in a phonetic script I didn't recognize. There were diagrams of sleeping figures arranged in circles, each marked with a different phase of the moon. Pages described a practice called communis somnium, the common dream. I remember sitting on the cold floor of the archive as The overhead lights buzzed. According to the codex, a group of monks once practiced synchronized dreaming, induced through incense, rhythm, and harmonic chant. They believed dreams were sacred architecture, temporary structures where divine beings could enter. I should have closed the book and reported the misfiling. Instead, I copied 3 pages by hand and left the library unnoticed, the sounds of Rome muted by what I'd just read. That night, I didn't sleep. Or maybe I did. I only remember lying in bed, listening to a rhythmic sound that didn't come from inside the room. It was soft, like chanting just out of range, just enough to feel like I wasn't alone. The next morning, I scanned the pages I'd copied into a secure folder on my laptop, labeling it under a fake academic project name to avoid attention. My plan was simple: identify the monastery mentioned in the codex and verify whether this order, Ordo Somnari, had ever officially existed. But the name didn't appear in any standard ecclesiastical registers or Vatican databases. It was as if the order had been deliberately erased. I broadened my search, focusing on archived letters, papal bulls, even excommunication records. Finally, in a 1762 letter buried in a scanned microfilm from the Diocese of Amalfi, I found a single reference. Those cloistered dreamers of Mount Turvo lost to fire and silence. That phrase kept repeating in my head. Mount Turvo. It wasn't a familiar location, but the name rang like a disguised place, something renamed or absorbed into something else. Old maps of the Campania region helped. I cross-referenced topographic changes and found an older name, Monte Cevario, scrubbed from most recent charts, located in a forested region south of Salerno. That's when the digital anomalies began. One night, while trying to access a 14th century registry on an Italian archival site, my screen flickered and redirected to a plain page. White background, black text, no links. It read, "You are seeing what should stay dreamed." Then it crashed. I checked the site later from a different network. No issues. Clean interface, no sign of tampering. I didn't tell anyone. The next clue came from a forgotten audio archive. A Vatican-funded ethnomusicologist had uploaded field recordings from defunct monastic orders in southern Italy, chanting fragments, liturgical experiments. Most were mundane, but one track, labelled only Servo 3 de Wave, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't melodic, it was rhythmic, layered, slow, almost like a pulse rendered in sound. I looped it through audio software and noticed something odd. Every 48 seconds a deep harmonic tone emerged just below human hearing. Infrasound. When I listened with noise-cancelling headphones, I felt it more than I heard it. My heart seemed to adjust to it. That night, I dreamed for the first time in weeks. In the dream, I wasn't me. I stood in a stone chamber surrounded by monks, faces obscured, all swaying in slow unison. No one spoke. But the rhythm, the same one from the recording, filled the space like a presence. When I woke, my room smelled faintly of ash and incense. My laptop, still open, now had a single new file on the desktop. I hadn't made it. Its name was just one word: continuare. I spent the next several days in a blur of quiet obsession, waking early and working late, cross-referencing names, dates, and regional records. The more I looked, the clearer it became that someone had tried very deliberately to bury the history of Mount Cervo. Vatican documents from the late 1600s referenced a liturgical irregularity in a southern monastery, followed by an order for structural demolition under the guise of seismic risk. But the dates didn't line up with any recorded earthquakes in the area. I found a marginal note in one of the scanned papal decrees that referred to a circular dormitorium and a harmonic envelope deemed incompatible with Roman doctrine. That phrase, harmonic envelope, wasn't theological, it was acoustic. I reached out to a contact in Florence, a sound historian named Luca, who specialized in early Christian chant. He agreed to meet over video call. When I played him the Cervo 3 WAV clip, he sat completely still for nearly a minute before speaking. "This isn't music," he said finally. "It's entertainment. This frequency pattern, it's designed to shift the body's autonomic rhythms, breathing, pulse, even thermoregulation. You can't chant like this by accident. It has to be designed to trigger a physiological state." I asked him if anything like this had appeared in early monastic practice. He shook his head. There were isolated experiments, chanting in domed spaces, use of resonant bowls, but nothing this structured. And certainly nothing outside official liturgical bounds. He paused. This was meant to do something, not expressing something. That's the difference. I thanked him, ended the call, and returned to the codex. One passage I'd previously overlooked now stood out. It described a ritual called Angelum Dormir, to sleep the angel. The text outlined a sequence of group preparations, incense of galbanum and myrrh, a circular sleeping arrangement, and precise harmonic tuning performed over the course of 9 nights. The purpose? To open the temporal veil and receive visions from beyond the chronology of man. Not heaven, not hell. Something outside time. I felt an unease settle in as I read the final line on the page. The visions bring light, the light brings memory, and memory brings collapse again and again. That night, the dream returned. This time I saw myself among them, swaying, chanting, but when I turned to look at the others, they all wore my face. The path to Mount Cervo wasn't on any map, but an old hikers forum mentioned ruins in the area, foundations of a monastery long forgotten, swallowed by forest. I drove south through the Campanian hills with a printed satellite image marked by coordinates I'd pulled from an 1823 surveyor's log. The car could only take me so far. I hiked the rest under a grey sky, the air thick with pine and wet stone. After 2 hours I found the remains. There weren't many. Just low walls swallowed by moss, and the faint curve of a structure that might have once been a dome. But the ground sloped inward unnaturally, forming a shallow bowl. The air felt heavier there, like the gravity had deepened. I walked the perimeter slowly until I found a patch of disturbed soil, too symmetrical to be natural. I dug with my hands until the stone met my fingers, flat, smooth, and cool, a buried tile. I cleared enough to reveal what looked like the center of a design, faint geometric lines etched into the stone, circles within circles, the same pattern I'd seen in the codex. I unpacked the portable recorder I'd brought and played the servo3.wav file aloud. I didn't expect anything to happen. I only wanted to see if the sound resonated in this place. But as the tone deepened, the forest around me seemed to quiet, the wind stilling, birds going silent. Then a vibration beneath my feet, barely noticeable, like the pulse of a large engine in the distance. I dropped to one knee and pressed my palm to the tile. It was warm. Not from the sun, there hadn't been any all day, but from something deeper. I shut off the recording and the warmth faded.
Instantly, I sat there, hand on stone, heart pacing, as a question grew louder than my own doubt. Was this ritual space still active?
Not sacred, not holy, just unfinished. I returned that night with incense, careful to match the ingredients from the codex as closely as I could. I stood in the center of the exposed design, lit the resin, and played the tone again. The heat returned. And then, just at the edge of hearing, the unmistakable sound of voices, not speaking but humming, low and distant, as if underground, not memory, not echo, something present, listening. I knew better than to tell anyone, but secrecy has a weight of its own. Back in Rome, I kept the incense burner sealed in a lead box and disabled the microphone on my laptop. Paranoia didn't arrive all at once. It crept in with small things, an unfamiliar number calling twice and never leaving a message, a Vatican badge scanner that flashes red before turning green, and one morning my apartment door slightly ajar, though I remembered locking it. I didn't mention the codex to Giulio. He had gone silent, no replies to messages, his office dark during hours he was always present. I began backing up my notes to encrypted drives stored at separate locations. The dream returned each night without variation, standing in that ruined circle, surrounded by others who always wore my face, our voices rising together into a frequency that left no room for thought. I'd wake with a sound still in my ears, a droning harmonic that made silence feel foreign. My body began reacting. I'd lose time during the day, minutes where I'd find myself staring at blank pages or forgetting how long I'd been in a room. A doctor might have called it fatigue. I called it interference. One night I returned from a research library to find my laptop open, though I had powered it down and stowed it in a drawer. On the screen was a single window, a media player paused, on a spectrogram analysis of the servo3.wav file. I hadn't opened it, but someone had. The playhead was positioned at the exact timestamp where the infrasound tone begins. Below it, a note had been typed into a blank document. It's not music, it's an invitation. That's when I stopped sleeping. I watched hours of archived Vatican Council footage, searching for anything on the Ordo Somnarii. Nothing direct, but in a closed session transcript from 1935, a cardinal mentioned a recurring vision contagion in the southern provinces and a directive to remove all mnemonic anchors. The language was clinical, the intent was clear, erasure. And yet the dream persisted, its details too consistent to be ordinary. The monks in the dream no longer moved. They watched me, and just before waking I'd hear a voice, not in Latin, not in any language I recognized, but I understood its meaning. Begin again, I didn't decide to return to Mount Cervo. I woke one morning parked on a roadside just beyond Salerno, the engine off, my jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat. I didn't remember packing, but in the glove box were the incense, the burner, and the recorder, prepared with a care that didn't feel like mine. I sat there for a long time, trying to piece together how I'd gotten there, but my memory was blank between bedtime and that morning fog. I walked the rest of the way, the path quieter than before, the forest pressing in more closely. At the clearing, the stone circle waited, still half buried, undisturbed. I set the incense in the centre, lit it, and placed the recorder at the southern mark. When the tone played, the vibration settled into my chest. Not just sound, but structure. I lay down, aligning myself with the northern etching. There was no transition, no slipping into sleep. One moment I was in the forest, the next I wasn't. I stood in a place without form, filled with rhythmic tones and a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere. A shape moved before me, not a figure exactly, but a presence. It pulsed in symmetrical patterns, geometric and organic, unfolding like thought-given shape.
It didn't speak. It was revealed. I saw the monks not as mystics, but as engineers of sleep. Their rituals weren't prayers, they were programs designed to open consciousness to something older, something outside of time. The entity was
not angelic, not divine. It was recursive. It offered visions that seeded civilizations, architecture, language, governance. But each vision looped, progress became repetition. Flourishing collapsed inward, the same rise, the same fall, again and again. When the monks realized this, they tried to stop the rituals, but silence, once broken, could not be restored. They lost their minds not from the entity's presence, but from its absence. The last among them buried the codex and carved a single line into the altar. Not prophecy, memory. I woke at dusk, the incense burned out, the forest alive again. I checked the recorder. It was blank, no file, no evidence, just the hum, faint and steady, behind my heartbeat. I hadn't uncovered anything. I had entered something ongoing, and it had no end. It's been 4 months since I returned from Mount Cervo, though time has lost its usual shape. I've left Rome, the apartment, the archive passes, even my name. I've let them all go. I rent a room in a quiet coastal town where no one asks questions, and the church bells are the only rhythm I allow myself to hear. I sleep little, but when I do, the dreams return. Always the same, the circle of stone, the chanting faces, the harmonic pulse, guiding us forward as if to a destination we'd reached before. At first, I tried to resist them. I'd wake in sweat, clutching pillows like anchors, whispering the words I heard before waking, words I still don't understand, but feel etched into the folds of thought. I deleted the audio file, burned my notebooks, smashed the recorder. It didn't help. The rhythm is no longer something I play, it's something I carry. A low vibration behind my heartbeat, constant and unshakable. I sometimes wonder if Giulio knew. If that sealed folio wasn't misfiled at all, but left there deliberately, waiting for someone like me, someone curious, untethered, willing. I haven't seen him since. Maybe he made the same journey and chose not to return. Or maybe returning was never the point. I think often about what the vision showed me, not just the cycle of rise and collapse, but the way each iteration believed it was the first. The comfort of progress, the illusion of forward movement, all of it guided gently by the same dream, the same rhythm, the same light. And when the echoes become too clear, when I sense the same symbols in the architecture of cities or the phrasing of sermons, I remind myself that this is not revelation. It's repetition. The entity doesn't punish. It doesn't guide. It reminds me. That's all. The monks had tried to keep the dream pure, contained within ritual. But now it's everywhere, embedded in music, in screen flicker rates, in the tones that end conference calls. What was once sacred is now ambient. And maybe that's the final collapse. Not destruction, but saturation. The dream is so widely dispersed that no one notices they're dreaming together. I'm not warning anyone. There's nothing to prevent, only to witness. The last page of the Codex wasn't a warning or a prophecy or a plea. It was an observation, scratched into the margin in a trembling hand. Each dream begins the same, with someone believing they've discovered it. The crystalline structures didn't register on radar, sonar, or thermal imaging, but they pulsed once every 108 seconds with a signal we couldn't trace. I didn't go to Antarctica looking for lost civilizations. I went for ice. Glacial core sampling, to be exact. 10 weeks embedded with the International Cryo-Archive Initiative, cataloguing ancient atmospheric data frozen in time. My background was data modeling, not archaeology. Nothing about our mission had the markings of mystery. We camped at Station 4R, a prefab dome buried under snowdrifts 40 miles inland from the Ross ice shelf. Conditions were punishing, the cold absolute, but the work was quiet, almost meditative. On the 12th day, we hit something. Not bedrock or volcanic shelf, but a seam in the ice that cracked like sugar glass. Beneath it were shapes, symmetrical, translucent, embedded in a cavern no one knew was there. I remember how Dr. Lee stood, frozen at the shaft's edge, her breath catching mid-sentence. The light from her headlamp struck the wall and refracted, not reflected, refracted, into a prism that seemed to move on its own. The structures inside weren't natural. They stood like pillars, perfectly spaced, each one slightly curved like an open book on display. The oddest part? The air around them wasn't frozen. It was cold, yes, but not brittle like the rest of the cavern. When I reached toward the nearest structure, my glove began to vibrate, softly, rhythmically. A pulse, like a heartbeat, slowed to a crawl. We called them the crystalline forms. Someone joked they looked like memory cards from an alien hard drive. We laughed, but no one touched them after that. That night I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but something else. I felt invited, like a question had been posed and I hadn't answered yet. I lay in my cot wrapped in thermal gear, eyes closed, and the dreams came slowly. First, in fragments, a tall city of columns, glowing with internal fire. Then a street of silence, empty shoes in the sand. Then a woman, or what I thought was a woman, kneeling before a tower that shimmered like glass under water. Her mouth moved. I couldn't hear her words, But I understood. This wasn't a message, it was a memory, and it didn't belong to me. The next morning, I didn't mention the dream. No one did, but I could tell I wasn't the only one who had seen something. Dr. Lee avoided eye contact. Henrik, our technician, looked pale and distracted, his usual sarcasm replaced with a quiet stillness. The team moved slower that day, as if the air inside the dome had thickened. I reviewed the environmental data from the cavern, humidity, pressure, temperature shifts, and flagged one anomaly, a consistent, low-frequency vibration recorded by the seismic sensors we'd left behind. It wasn't natural. The readings pulsed in intervals 108 seconds apart, exactly. I isolated the waveform and ran it through audio processing software, expecting static or noise. Instead, the pattern resolved into something eerily deliberate. There was a rise and fall in the frequency curve, like syllables in a whispered word. I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't just vibration, but information. I uploaded the raw data to our off-grid server and cross-referenced it against geological databases. Nothing matched. Then, late that evening, I noticed something strange in the storage logs. A private folder had been created on our internal drive, time-stamped at 03:08 a.m. when all personnel were accounted for and asleep. The file name was a string of characters that looked like corrupted code, but when I cleaned it up, it translated, crudely, into memory number 14. I opened it. Inside was a compressed video file. There was no record of a camera being active in the cavern, yet the footage was unmistakable. A slow pan across the crystalline structures, their surfaces shimmering faintly in the dark. The video was filmed from ground level, as if someone had crawled in alone without authorization. Halfway through, the frame stopped. A person, Henrik, stood in front of one of the forms, eyes closed, unmoving. The footage was cut out. I confronted him quietly the next morning. He denied everything. Claimed he hadn't left the dome during the night. His vitals, logged by our biometric sensors, backed him up. But I didn't believe him. That night, the dream returned, this time clearer. I stood beneath a sky with no stars in a city made of bone-white glass. Wind howled through silent towers. Something had happened there. Something final. I awoke with a single word in my mind, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. Archive. Over the next 3 days, the pattern deepened. Quiet shifts in behavior, small technical anomalies, and dreams that no longer felt personal. We kept collecting samples and logging data, but no one spoke about the crystalline structures anymore. The subject was avoided like a shared wound no one wanted to press. On the 4th night, I stayed up reviewing old expedition records from the station's previous occupants, mostly climate researchers and geologists. Most of the files were dull, but one folder stood out. It had no formal title, just a string of initials and a date, EB 1997. Inside were transcribed field notes from a biologist named Elena Branco. Her writing was calm at first, routine entries about ice algae and microbial anomalies. Then her tone changed. On day 17, she described finding mineral formations in a subglacial cave that refract thought. The phrase stopped me cold. She claimed that after camping near the site, her team began experiencing shared symbolic dreams and a sense of displaced identity. I cross-referenced her GPS coordinates with our current location. Same region, within 6 kilometers. The records ended abruptly. No incident report, no summary. Just a final line. The shapes are not of this world, but they speak like memory. I tried looking her up in the National Science Registry. Nothing. No publications, no retirement notice, not even a death record. It was as if she'd never existed. I forwarded the file to Dr. Lee under a blank subject line. She didn't respond. The next morning, Henrik was gone. His parka was missing, but all exit logs showed no movement overnight. His tracker, embedded in his ID badge, pinged once from the edge of the cavern and then went dark. We searched for hours, no sign, no footprints, no disturbed snow. It was as if he had dissolved. We radioed Base South for assistance, but the signal was weak, barely coherent. A passing weather front was jamming long-range transmission, at least that's what we told ourselves. That night, I lay awake listening to the pulse under the ice. Every 108 seconds it came, steady, patient.
Like breath. When I finally slept, the dream came in a rush.
I was walking through a flooded hall, walls lined with shining glyphs. Each symbol shimmered with quiet grief. I touched one, and an entire life unfurled inside me, a woman with silver eyes watching her child vanish into a black sun. I woke up sobbing, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that it hadn't been her dream. It had been her memory. After Henrik vanished, Station 4 turned quiet in a different way. The usual background noise, the hum of heaters, the tap of keys, the soft static of open radio channels, felt muffled, as if the dome had been insulated from the world. Dr. Lee spoke even less, spending most of her time reviewing thermal scans or walking loops around the perimeter. On the third day, without contact from Base South, she made a decision. "We're going back into the cavern," she said flatly. "We log it properly, then we leave." I didn't argue, neither did Mikkel, the only other technician remaining. We descended just after sunrise, though down there, light didn't matter. The narrow shaft had been reinforced with steel ladders and guide ropes, but the deeper we went, the more the air thickened. The crystalline chamber felt colder than before, though the instruments disagreed. The structures were unchanged, rows of transparent curved forms, still and gleaming. But something was different. They had shifted slightly, as if someone had rearranged the shelves of an invisible library. I moved carefully, camera rolling, logging angles and reflections. Dr. Lee stood silently in front of one of the larger forms, unmoving. Mikkel, for reasons he didn't explain, wandered toward the back wall. That's when I noticed the corner. It wasn't visible before. A shallow corridor, barely taller than a man, leading into shadow. I stepped inside. My headlamp flickered, not out of battery, but like something interfered with its circuitry. The corridor opened into a secondary chamber, smaller, more confined, but filled with the same curved objects, though these were fractured. Pieces of crystalline memory lay scattered across the floor like shattered windows. At the center was something else, a slab, flat and dark with a circular depression at its core. Above it, etched into the ice wall, were symbols I hadn't seen before, tighter, denser, almost mathematical. I reached for my scanner, but before I could activate it, something shifted in the ice behind me. A tone, low, steady, filled the
space, not through the air, but through my chest, vibrating directly against my bones.
I turned, expecting to see movement. There was nothing, just the broken forms, still and gleaming. Then the dreams returned that night, stronger. This time I wasn't just watching, I was living it. A city swallowed by light, a council of beings, dissolving into fog. A final archive, sealed in frost, waiting for someone to open it. When I woke, the shape of that slab was still burned into my memory, and I understood somehow that it wasn't meant for us. It had always been meant for someone else, someone long gone. 2 days after exploring the second chamber, Dr. Lee began isolating herself. She stopped checking the comms terminal, stopped reviewing incoming data, and instead spent hours sitting near the entrance shaft, staring at the ice. When I approached, her with updates, she barely acknowledged me. That morning, I found one of her field notebooks open on the mess table. Every page was filled with repeating symbols, tight and geometric, identical to the etchings from the slab wall. They weren't sketches, they were copies. I confronted her gently, asking if she remembered writing them. She didn't respond. Later, I checked the audio logs stored on our secure drive. The system had recorded a transmission at 3:12 a.m., a frequency we didn't use. The file was corrupted, partially overwritten, but segments remained. My voice was on the recording, or something that sounded like me. It was whispering a sequence of numbers over and over, coordinates. I mapped them. They pointed to 3 separate locations, one in the Peruvian Andes, one beneath the floor of the Indian Ocean, and one in central Antarctica, less than 4 kilometers from our current site. That afternoon, I found Mikkel in the equipment shed, disassembling one of our backup transmitters. When I asked why, he looked confused. Said he thought it was broken. It wasn't. None of us mentioned the dreams anymore, but I could see it in our faces. The exhaustion, the haunted silence. That night I made a decision. I backed up all digital logs onto an encrypted drive and packed it into a lead-lined case, the kind we used for magnetic field tests. If something happened to us, I needed a way to get the data out. I drafted a transmission to Base South, coded, with a fail-safe protocol that would trigger in 48 hours unless manually stopped. It included our full findings, our location, and a single sentence: "The structures are not human." As I reviewed the message, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to delete it. Not out of fear, but something stranger. Doubt. What if we weren't supposed to warn anyone? What if this was meant to stay hidden, not by accident, but by design? I sent it anyway. When I returned to my bunk, I found a piece of paper resting on my pillow. No footprints in the snow. No signs of forced entry. Just one word written in careful block letters. Listen. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there, eyes open, listening for the next pulse under the ice. It came exactly on time. The transmission failed. I found out the next morning when I checked the uplink log. No signal confirmation, no bounce back, just a blank timestamp where the data handoff should have occurred. The failsafe should have been activated, but it hadn't. I tried manually sending the archive again, but the system refused to initialize. The screen displayed a message I hadn't programmed. Signal absorbed. That same morning, the lights flickered across the dome. Instruments began resetting at random. Our environmental sensors showed false temperature spikes, then deep drops far below survivable levels, yet inside the dome it was still. No frost, no malfunction, just unreadable data. Dr. Lee was nowhere to be found. Her parka remained in its locker. So did her gloves, boots, and comms tag. No one could leave the dome without triggering an alert. None had gone off. I checked the camera feed from the night before, corrupted. Nothing recorded after 2:47 a.m. Mikkel was breaking apart a communications panel when I found him. I shouted. He didn't stop. Just kept unscrewing the bolts with slow, mechanical precision. When I pulled him away, he looked through me like I wasn't there. His voice was flat. "They're not warnings," he said. "They're conclusions." Then he collapsed. No injuries, no trauma, just unconscious. I ran a scan of his vitals. His EEG was erratic, spiking and falling in patterns I recognized immediately. They matched the pulse signal. I placed him in isolation, powered down the system, and locked the outer hatch. But it was too late. The rhythm was inside everything. Our drives, our power converters, even the biometric sensors. It had found a path. That night, I returned to the second chamber. Alone, I brought no equipment, just a notebook and a headlamp. The corridor was exactly as I remembered, but the fractured forms were gone. Not shattered, absent. The slab at the center now pulsed with a dim blue light. I stepped forward and placed my hand on its surface. No sound, no tremor. Just a stillness so complete it felt like the pause between heartbeats. Then I saw everything. Not as images, but as experience. 1,000,000 lifetimes, lovers mourning under violet suns, cities grown from coral-like machines, words ending in silence, not violence. The crystalline forms had not been built. They had grown, cultivated repositories of memory, seeded across dying worlds, preserved beneath ice, rock, or sea. This was not Earth's story. It never had been. We were not the readers. We were the next entry. I fell to my knees, weeping. Not out of fear, but recognition. They hadn't just left their stories behind. They had prepared a record, a goodbye with shape. And now it was open again. I stayed another day, maybe 2, I couldn't tell. The pulse no longer startled me. It felt familiar now, like the second hand of a clock I no longer needed to check. Mikkel never woke. His body remained stable, his brain waves still aligned with the crystalline rhythm. I monitored him until the instrument stopped working. Then I just sat beside him and listened. Dr. Lee never returned. I stopped looking. I think in some part of myself, I already knew she had been absorbed, not physically, but into the current of memory. There was no panic in me anymore, no urgency, only the question, what do we do with a truth too big for? A single species. I wrote everything down by hand. Pages and pages, not to publish, not even to send, but so the act of writing might tether me to something real. I knew no one would believe it, even if they read it. Crystalline books that reveal extinct civilizations in your sleep. It sounds like a delusion, but I lived it. And in the end, I understood what the vault beneath the ice was. It wasn't a relic. It was a shelter, not from danger, but from forgetting. Each structure held a final account, a memory of a people facing extinction and choosing, instead of noise or panic, to preserve their ending like a story waiting for a listener. Not to save themselves, but to leave something behind, a signal that someone somewhere once existed. I left the dome on foot at first light, carrying only a single notebook and a locator beacon. The beacon was half dead, and the weather should have killed me. But it didn't. Somehow I was found, half frozen, but alive. I don't remember the journey back, only the quiet looks the medics gave each other when they read my notes. They didn't ask questions. They sedated me. I was debriefed, discharged and forgotten. I live quietly now off-grid. I won't talk about what happened, but I still dream. Not of Earth, but of other skies, fractured moons, dust-choked oceans, cities made of sound. Each night, a different ending, a different civilization. And when I wake, I write it down. I think, that's what the library wants. Not to be discovered, not to be solved, but remembered. One ending at a time. I didn't come to Pumapunku to prove anything, I just wanted quiet. But then the stones started humming back. I'd been in Bolivia for 3 weeks, mostly working alone, cataloguing fragments from the western edge of Pumapunku, the lesser visited area. Away from the groups, snapping photos of precision cut blocks. My funding was minimal, my equipment basic. But that was the point. No team, no agenda, just time. The air was thin and crisp, and the plateau stretched out like a riddle left.
Half-solved.
Most days I recorded soil stratigraphy and took reference shots. Nothing unusual. Until the morning I found the first flute. It was tucked in a seam between 2 massive stone slabs, each weighing several tons. The instrument was obsidian, impossibly so, not chipped or carved, but seemingly poured and polished, without a single fracture. At first I assumed it was ornamental. I'd seen ceremonial objects before, replicas usually. But this wasn't ceremonial, this was something else. I didn't try to play it, of course. I bagged it, tagged it, and logged the coordinates. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Something about its smoothness, its weight, the way it felt warm, despite the cold stone around it. The next day, I found a second one. This time, half buried beneath a toppled lintel. Same shape, same eerie smoothness. I laid them side by side in my tent, their surfaces catching the dusk light. That's when
I heard it, a hum, not loud, but there, low and layered, like a distant chord struck underwater.
I stepped outside expecting machinery or a vehicle nearby. Nothing, just wind. I walked back into the tent, and it was stronger. I leaned closer to the flutes. The sound shifted. Then one of the stones outside gave a small, sharp creak.
Just a fraction of movement, but it moved. I stood frozen, staring at the massive block.
It didn't slide or fall. It was adjusted, as if correcting its posture. The next morning, I re-measured the alignment grid. One corner was off by several centimeters. I hadn't mismeasured. Something had shifted. I told myself it was thermal, expansion or wind erosion or sleep deprivation. But I knew better. Something here responded to sound. And somehow the flutes weren't artifacts, they were part of the mechanism. The nearest stable internet connection was a 40-minute drive, east down a road that barely qualified as one. I didn't tell anyone what I was looking for when I got there, just ordered weak coffee from a roadside cafe with Wi-Fi and opened my laptop. I wasn't sure what to search for. Obsidian Flute brought up tourist souvenirs. Pumapunku, sound technology, led to forums filled with half-formed theories and old History Channel clips. But when I narrowed it to academic databases and ran a search in Quechua and Aymara archives, something strange surfaced. A scanned field journal. From 1923, written by a German linguist named Rainer Schwartz, referenced singing stones and black tubes that speak. No images, just a description. Polished volcanic glass, length consistent with a traditional flute, stored in the crevices of sacred stone formations. The entry was brief, and the journal hadn't been cited since its digitization. That led me down another rabbit hole, patents. There were a few from the 1970s filed and abandoned for acoustic excavation devices. All cited high-resonance harmonic tools, but none were ever built. They included vague sketches, something that looked uncomfortably close to what I had found. That's when I reached out to Dr. Sienna Rocha, a sound archaeologist I'd met once during a dig in Mexico. I didn't tell her much, just asked if she'd ever come across stone structures reacting to low-frequency tones. Her reply came fast. Not unless you're dealing with sympathetic resonance or trick acoustics. Why? I sent her a photo of the flutes. 10 minutes later, she called. I could hear her pacing. She said she'd seen something like them in a private collection in Chile, locked away by a mining heir who claimed they were cursed. She thought it was a hoax. Now she wasn't sure. Before we ended the call, she asked me to record the hum, if I could, and send it over. That night, I waited until the site was silent, and I placed one of the flutes near the same stone that had shifted. I didn't even blow into it. I just touched it lightly against the stone's surface. The sound didn't come from the flute. It came from underneath, like the mountain was listening, like it wanted to speak back. I stayed up most of that night, playing back the recording on a loop through noise analysis software, trying to isolate the hum beneath the ambient noise. It wasn't just sound, it was structured. 3 dominant frequencies spaced evenly, repeating every 7 seconds. I matched the pattern against known acoustic phenomena, wind harmonics, seismic noise, even magnetic interference. But nothing fit. Sienna called again the next morning. She hadn't slept either. "This isn't geological," she said. "It's tuned." Her voice was low, cautious. She'd run the same analysis on the sample I sent and layered it over a 1940s military file she had access to from a declassified sound research program in Peru. It matches. I didn't know what to say. The 1940s file referenced something called resonant language, a term I'd never heard before. It detailed an effort to use sound to manipulate dense materials, specifically basalt and granite. According to the notes, tests were abandoned after several subjects experienced dizziness, amnesia, and auditory hallucinations. But a line near the bottom of the report stood out. Subject report sensation of being restructured from within. I copied it into my notebook and underlined it twice. That afternoon, I returned to the site alone. I hadn't told the regional.
Office about the flutes or the shifts in the stones. I wasn't ready for scrutiny.
I brought a small speaker and played the recording back near the southeast wall of the temple ruins, slowly increasing the volume. At first, nothing. Then the stones responded again. Not movement this time, but vibration. Measurable. I placed my palm flat against the surface and felt it, steady, almost like breath. The air around the stones became thick, weighted. I backed off, heart pounding, not with fear, but awe. The idea struck me hard. The stones weren't built to resist time or the elements. They were built to respond. I checked my notes. The original.
H-shaped stones were not only precision cut, but aligned in ways that seemed unnecessary, until now. When sound hit them, they behaved like tuning forks.
If the builders weren't cutting stone with tools, maybe they were shaping it with vibration, carving with resonance instead of chisels. I didn't want to say it out loud, but the implication was clear. This wasn't construction, it was communication. 2 days later, I drove 3 hours southwest to an abandoned colonial church near the base of the Cordillera Real. The place had long been rumored to sit atop pre-Incan ruins, though no formal excavation had ever been approved. I had heard whispers from local farmers, stories of strange stones hidden beneath the altar, stones that would ring when struck, even without metal. I brought one of the obsidian flutes with me, wrapped in cloth and tucked inside my pack. The church was empty, its walls crumbling and its pews broken by decades of weather. Light filtered through shattered windows in fractured beams, dust moving through them like ash in water. I stepped quietly toward the altar, which was little more than a rotting platform of wood and stone. Beneath it, as promised, was a stone slab. I tapped it lightly with the flute. The sound that came back was unmistakable, deep, harmonic, and vibrating from below. I removed the slab carefully, exposing a staircase choked with rubble. It took hours to clear, but eventually I made it down into a chamber no more than 15 feet across. The walls were cut smooth, not by erosion or tools, but by some other means entirely. And in the center, resting on a worn stone pedestal, was a third flute. This one was darker than the others, almost blue-black, and warmer to the touch. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up.
I didn't play it. I didn't even raise it to my lips, but the chamber shifted when I touched it. The hum started again, not from the flute, but from the very air around me. The other 2 flutes in my pack vibrated gently against each other,
like they were responding to it. I sat down and tried to breathe through the pressure building in my chest. On the far wall, carved shallowly into the stone, was something I hadn't seen in any record or textbook. A spiral, interrupted by small,
geometric notches that mirrored the pattern I had seen in the frequency analysis. It wasn't art, it was instruction, or maybe a sentence.
A sentence not meant for speaking, but for playing. A language written in tone, stored in stone. I left the chamber after an hour, but I was different when I emerged. Tired, yes, but with something else moving behind my eyes. Like a rhythm I couldn't stop hearing, like a voice I couldn't yet understand. I told myself I'd wait before trying to play them together. I told myself I needed more data, more time, more control. But the truth was I was afraid. Not of what would happen to the stones. but of what might happen to me. Still, the pressure to act was growing. I'd stopped checking in with the regional office. My emails had gone unanswered. I noticed a man I didn't recognize watching my supply drop from a distance 2 days in a row. At night, I began hearing a faint tone in my ears, even when nothing was playing, an afterimage of sound, like memory turned physical. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped sleeping at all. Then Sienna called again. She'd run more analysis. Her voice was uneven. "There's syntax," she said. "The waveform data, when you compare the flute's harmonics, they're not just resonant. They're structured, like grammar, like speech." I told her about the chamber, the spiral notation, the third flute. She went silent for a long time, then said, "If they're speaking, what are they saying, and what does it do to someone who listens?" That question stayed with me. I began noticing other changes, subtle at first. My hands trembled slightly after holding the flutes too long. When I tried to write, I found myself drawing notations instead, spirals, dots, waves. They weren't symbols I'd seen before, but they made sense to me, like I was remembering them instead of inventing them. I decided to test the full set at the base of the main Puma Punku platform, early, just after sunrise. No tourists. No staff. I placed the 3 flutes evenly in a semicircle, matching their orientation to the etched spiral I'd copied. When I played them gently, in sequence, the air changed, not louder, thicker. The sound layered itself into the space between the stones. I felt it in my jaw, my spine, my chest. The stones shifted again. Not wildly, not dangerously, but deliberately. Realignment, correction, rebalancing. I took a step back, but my legs felt hollow. My skin itches with static. Then I saw the drone just above the tree line. Silent, watching. Someone had followed me, and now someone knew what I'd found. The footage leaked 3 days later, not by me. I had encrypted the files, stored them offline, air-gapped and buried in metadata, but someone got them. A low-resolution clip appeared on an anonymous forum titled simply "Floating Stone Bolivia." It was only 6 seconds long, but it showed enough. A massive carved block trembling, lifting slightly, tilting into alignment as a faint, harmonic tone filled the background. The reaction was immediate, half ridicule, half awe. But to those who understood the context, it was a declaration. I went dark. I shut down my devices, stashed the flutes in separate cases, and moved north by foot, avoiding roads, avoiding people. The dreams started soon after. At first they were silent, just shapes and vibrations. Then they turned audibly. I would hear tones layered in threes, overlaid with visual echoes of the spiral script. In the last dream, I spoke. I didn't understand the words, but I woke up mouthing them. That morning, one of the flutes had cracked slightly along its side, not from damage, but from internal stress, like something had shifted inside it. That same day, I found a printed note taped to the inside of my shelter. No footprints nearby, no sounds during the night. It read, "Do not complete the scale." That night I checked the waveform data again. The tones, when sequenced, as I had played them at the platform, formed the beginning of a harmonic ladder, a progression, not just communication, but activation. And I hadn't finished it. But someone had. Sienna called from a burner. She didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was hollow. One of the stones at Tiwanaku moved, not just shifted, changed. They're not static anymore. They're reactive. She said something else had happened. Her lab was broken into, files wiped, backups erased. No theft, just removal. She didn't think it was the government. "Too clean," she said. "Too fast." I told her about the dreams. She was silent for a long time. "I think they weren't building structures," she said finally. "They were building language, and you're learning it." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't, because she was right. Something in me had changed, and it wasn't done yet. I left the Highlands 2 weeks ago. I haven't gone back. The flutes are buried now, each in a different location, wrapped in lead sheeting and sealed in volcanic ash. I didn't mark the coordinates. I couldn't trust myself not to return. The last time I held one, my fingers moved without thought, playing tones I didn't recognize but understood. I wasn't afraid of the sound anymore. I was afraid of what it wanted from me. Since then, the world has quieted in unnatural ways. Background noises feel thinner. Even silence feels like a pause, not an absence. I've stayed in motion, renting rooms under other names, keeping contact minimal. Sienna's last message came 4 days ago. It was just a sound file, 3 notes, played slowly, then reversed. I haven't replied. I don't know where she is now. Sometimes I wonder if she went further than I did, if she finished the scale. I keep a notebook with me, though I no longer write in it. The pages are full of spirals and shapes that look like maps but don't lead anywhere. I dream less now. When I do, it's always the same. The stones floating slightly above the earth, turning gently, not as monuments, but as phrases in a sentence still being written. I used to think this was a discovery, a buried technology waiting to be found. But that's not it. It was never about tools, it was about understanding. The builders weren't engineers, they were listeners. People who had trained themselves to hear not just sound, but structure in sound, meaning in resonance. They didn't shape stone by force. They asked for it to change, and it did. The flutes weren't instruments. They were keys. And I opened something. I don't believe I was chosen. I think I was available. Curious enough to follow. Alone enough to hear. Now I carry something I can't name. A tension behind the eyes, a rhythm beneath my skin. It hums when the world is quiet. I live with it now, a reminder that once you've heard the language of matter, silence is never the same again.